the story of the Incas cannot begin with the Incas themselves. To understand how such a vast empire came to exist high in the mountains of South America, you must go back thousands of years before their rise, into the long history of the Andes. This setting, so different from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia or the wide plains of Egypt, shaped every civilization that would later emerge there. Towering peaks, deep valleys, and a climate that shifted between extremes of cold and heat formed a unique world where survival depended on careful adaptation. People who lived here had to learn to coax crops from steep mountainsides, to herd animals that could endure thin air, and to read the signs of the seasons with precision. By the time the Incas appeared in the historical record, countless generations of cultures had already built the foundations on which their empire would rest. Archaeological discoveries show that human presence in the Andes stretches back more than 10,000 years. At first, these were small communities of hunters and gatherers who relied on wild game, tubers, and seasonal plants. Over time, as populations settled into more permanent sites, they began experimenting with early agriculture. Maize, potatoes, quinoa, and beans would eventually become staples of Andean life, but the road to domestication was long. Some of the earliest evidence of organized agriculture comes from the Norte Chico civilization, which flourished along the Peruvian coast around 3000 BCE. Often overlooked compared to the grand empires of the Old World, Norte Chico represents one of the earliest known complex societies in the Americas. Its people built monumental structures out of stone, developed irrigation systems to channel water into arid lands, and organized large populations without leaving behind any written language. Instead, their legacy survives in the massive platform mounds and sunken plazas that dot the coastal desert. From these beginnings, Andean cultures evolved in cycles of rise and decline. After Norte Chico, new societies appeared in both the coastal lowlands and the highlands. Among them were the Chavin, a culture that thrived from around 900 to 200 BCE. Centered at Chavin de Huanta, a ceremonial complex deep in the mountains, this culture left behind an extraordinary religious legacy. Stone carvings depict fanged deities and hybrid creatures, half human and half animal, suggesting a worldview where divine forces controlled every aspect of life. Pilgrims from across the Andes travelled to Chavin de Huanta, carrying their regional traditions with them and spreading Chavin influence in return. Even though the Chavin eventually declined, their art, symbolism, and religious ideas left a permanent mark on later Andean societies. The rise of the Moche along the northern coast between 100 and 700 CE added another layer to this cultural foundation. The Moche built pyramids of adobe brick, some rising as high as 10 stories, and decorated them with vivid murals depicting gods, warriors, and rituals. They mastered metalwork, creating delicate ornaments of gold and silver, and they excelled in pottery, producing vessels shaped like humans, animals, and scenes of daily life. These ceramics provide a window into their society, showing images of combat, sacrifice, and ceremony that give modern scholars clues about their values and structure. The Moche also engineered complex irrigation systems that allowed them to thrive in a desert environment where rainfall was scarce. Their ability to transform barren land into fertile fields was a lesson future civilizations, including the Incas, would inherit and expand upon. Another key influence was the Nazca culture, remembered for its vast geoglyphs etched into the desert floor. Spanning hundreds of square kilometers, these lines form patterns of animals, plants, and geometric designs, visible in full only from the air. The purpose of these geoglyphs remains debated. Some scholars suggest they were ritual pathways, walked as part of religious ceremonies, while others believe they were astronomical markers aligned with the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. Whatever their function, they reveal a society deeply concerned with cosmic forces and the balance between human life and the natural world. This concern with cosmic order, visible across Andean civilizations, would later be woven into the Inca worldview in profound ways. highland cultures developed their own distinct contributions. The Tiwanaku civilization, based near Lake Titicaca from around 500 to 1000 CE, created monumental architecture out of finely cut stone, fitting blocks together so tightly that even a knife blade could not pass between them. Their temples, gateways and statues suggest a sophisticated religious system that drew pilgrims from across the region. Tiwanaku also pioneered agricultural techniques such as raised field farming, where crops were planted on elevated platforms surrounded by canals that moderated temperature and provided irrigation. This innovation allowed them to feed large populations despite the harsh highland environment. Contemporaneous with Tiwanaku, the Wari civilization emerged further north, building administrative centres and road networks that foreshadowed the later achievements of the Incas. The Wari introduced terraced farming on a massive scale and experimented with urban planning, creating cities with orthogonal layouts that suggest a high degree of central authority. Their influence extended across much of the central Andes, setting precedents in governance, infrastructure and agriculture that the Incas would later refine. By the time the Incas rose to prominence in the early 13th century, they inherited a landscape already rich with centuries of innovation. Every terrace cut into a mountainside, every canal diverting water into dry valleys, every ritual honouring sun, moon or mountain spirits represented knowledge accumulated over generations. The Incas did not create their empire in isolation. They built upon this foundation, drawing from the achievements of the Chavin, the Moche, the Nazca, the Tiwanaku, and the Wari. They absorbed techniques of farming, architecture, and governance, combining them into a system more expansive and more unified than anything that had come before. The Andes themselves remained the central challenge and central inspiration. The geography of the region, with its dizzying heights, deep gorges, and unpredictable climate, demanded resilience. Communities learned to adapt by diversifying their crops across different altitudes, creating vertical economies where potatoes might grow in one zone, maize in another, and llamas and alpacas could be herded in yet another. This strategy reduced risk, ensuring that if one crop failed, others might still succeed. The concept of vertical archipelagos, where communities controlled lands in multiple ecological zones, became a cornerstone of Andean survival. As centuries passed, myth and memory wove together. People told stories of creator gods like Viracocha, who shaped the land and sent forth the ancestors of the Inca. Sacred mountains, or apus, became protectors of communities, their peaks looming as constant reminders of divine presence. Lakes, rivers, and stones were seen as wakas, sacred places imbued with spiritual power. In this environment, religion was not separate from daily life, but intertwined with every act of farming, building, or travelling. Offerings were made before planting fields, prayers were spoken before journeys, and ceremonies marked every significant change in season. The Incas would later institutionalize this worldview, creating a state religion centered on the worship of Inti, the sun, but its roots stretched back into these earlier traditions that saw the entire landscape as alive with spirit. The early Andean civilizations were not unified under a single power. Instead, they existed as networks of cultures, sometimes trading with each other, sometimes competing, and sometimes collapsing under the weight of environmental challenges. Climate shifts, prolonged droughts, and El Niño events disrupted agriculture and contributed to the decline of societies like the Moche and Nazca. Yet even when civilizations fell, their knowledge did not vanish completely. It persisted in local traditions, in farming practices, in religious rituals, waiting to be absorbed and transformed by the next rising power. This long prelude is essential, because the Incas would later present themselves as inheritors of a sacred order stretching back to the dawn of time. They portrayed their rulers as descendants of divine ancestors, their cities as embodiments of cosmic design, and their empire as the culmination of a destiny foretold. In truth, Their accomplishments were as much a product of centuries of cultural accumulation as of their own innovation. The Incas did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from this vast, layered history of Andean civilizations, each one contributing pieces of knowledge, technology, and belief that would converge in the empire centered at Cusco. The emergence of the Incas as a distinct people is inseparable from the legends that later chroniclers recorded, and those legends themselves are shaped by the memories of these earlier times. To follow the story further, one must move from archaeology and the silent remains of ancient temples into the realm of myth, where divine figures step forward to guide humanity, and where the ancestors of the Incas are said to have risen from the waters of Lake Titicaca or from the caves of Pacaritambo, carrying with them the destiny of empire. The origins of the Inca world are carried not only in ruins of stone and terraces of earth, but in myths that reach back to times when gods and humans were not yet clearly separated. The Andean landscape itself seemed to demand stories that explained its mountains, its lakes, and its skies, and over the centuries these stories crystallized into narratives that gave the Incas their sense of purpose. Among all of them, none was more important than the account of Viracocha, the great creator god, and of Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, the legendary ancestors who would lay the foundation for the dynasty of Cusco. Viracocha was remembered as the god who shaped the world from the void. In many versions of the myth, he emerges from the waters of Lake Titicaca, the vast inland sea that straddles the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia. This lake, high in the mountains and surrounded by peaks that rise like guardians, was seen as a place of origin, a womb of creation. From here, Viracocha called forth the sun, the moon, and the stars, ordering the heavens so that time itself could begin. He gave shape to the earth, raising mountains, carving valleys, and filling rivers with flowing water. After the world was prepared, he created the first generation of humans. Yet in these stories, creation was not perfect. The first beings fashioned by Viracocha were giants, immense in size but flawed in character. They disobeyed the god, refused to honour his authority, and disrupted the balance of the world. For their arrogance, Viracocha destroyed them, turning some into stone and others into mountains, leaving behind the strange rock formations scattered across the Andes as reminders of this first failed age. Then he began anew, creating a second humanity from smaller figures who would live more humbly within the limits of the world he had prepared. These were the ancestors of the peoples of the Andes, each emerging from their own sacred places, called Pacarinas, whether lakes, caves, or springs. The myth emphasizes both order and correction. The god does not abandon creation after his first attempt fails, but reshapes it, ensuring that humanity will endure. He gives laws to the people, teaches them how to live, and assigns them places where they are to dwell. Then he departs, walking across the surface of the Andes, sometimes disguised as a beggar or a wanderer, testing the generosity of those he encounters. In this image, Viracocha becomes not just a distant creator, but a god who remains present in subtle ways, hidden among humans, judging their behaviour and rewarding or punishing accordingly. The Incas later wove this myth into their own political story. They presented themselves as chosen descendants of this great act of creation, heirs to the divine order established by Viracocha. When they expanded across the Andes, they often told conquered peoples that their origins too lay in the Pacarinas shaped by the creator god, binding diverse communities into a shared sacred history. By appealing to Viracocha, they could claim that their authority was not arbitrary, but sanctioned by the very being who had made the world. Yet the Incas also had their own distinct origin legend, one that linked them specifically to Cusco, the heart of their empire. This was the story of Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, remembered as siblings and as the first rulers of the Inca line. In its most familiar version, the sun god Inti, seeing the world in need of guidance, sent his children to bring civilization to humankind. Manco Capac and Mama Oclo rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca, carrying with them a golden staff given by their father. Their mission was to find a place where the staff would sink easily into the earth, a sign that the land was fertile and destined to become the centre of their people. They travelled across the highlands, testing the soil in valley after valley. At last, in a place surrounded by mountains and fed by rivers, the staff slid effortlessly into the ground. This was the Valley of Cusco, and here they founded their settlement. From this starting point, the legend says, they taught the local people the arts of agriculture, weaving, and social order. Mama Oklo instructed the women in spinning and household crafts, while Manco Capac taught the men how to farm, build houses, and worship the sun. In this way, they transformed scattered and primitive communities into the seeds of a great civilization. The story carries layers of meaning. It portrays the Incas as civilizers, bringers of knowledge and order to those who lacked it. It links their authority directly to Inti, the sun, whose warmth and light sustained all life in the highlands. It also connects them to the sacred landscape, for Cusco was not chosen arbitrarily but marked by divine signs. By claiming that their ancestors had been sent by the sun itself, the Incas reinforced their political claim to rule as not just kings, but as representatives of cosmic forces on Earth. Other versions of the story place the origins not at Lake Titicaca, but at Pacaritambo, a cave outside Cusco. In this account, 4 brothers and 4 sisters emerge from the earth, each embodying different qualities. Among them, Manco Capac emerged as the leader, while his siblings fell into rivalry. The story describes struggles between the brothers, with some being turned to stone or trapped underground, leaving Manco Capac and his sister wife Mama Okolo to establish dominance. This version emphasizes themes of competition and legitimacy, suggesting that even among the first ancestors there were conflicts that had to be resolved before true authority could be established. These myths do not exist in isolation. They reflect the values and concerns of the societies that told them. The emphasis on emergence from lakes and caves highlights the Andean belief that the land itself was sacred and that people were directly tied to it. The idea of siblings marrying to continue the divine line echoes Andean practices of maintaining purity within ruling families. The focus on teaching agriculture and crafts underlines the importance of order, labour and reciprocity in sustaining society. When Spanish chroniclers recorded these stories after the conquest, they sometimes altered them, blending native accounts with their own interpretations. Yet even through this filter, the central themes remain visible. The Incas saw themselves as children of the sun, as bringers of civilization, and as rightful rulers chosen by divine forces. Their myths gave them not only a past, but a mandate for the future, justifying their expansion and their demand for obedience from conquered peoples. It is important to see how these myths functioned politically. The Inca Empire was vast and diverse, encompassing many different ethnic groups with their own traditions and gods. By presenting themselves as the children of Inti and descendants of Viracocha, the rulers of Cusco offered a story that could encompass everyone. They did not deny local origins. Instead, they wove them into a larger narrative, claiming that all Pacarinas ultimately derived from the same act of creation, and that the Incas had been chosen to guide humanity within that cosmic order. The myths also provided rituals that reinforced their truth. Each year in Cusco, the festival of Inti Raymi celebrated the sun god, with ceremonies that recalled the origins of the dynasty. The royal family traced its lineage back to Manco Capac and Mama Oklo, presenting themselves as living embodiments of the myth. The temples of the sun, especially the Great Coricancha in Cusco, embodied the idea that the Incas stood at the centre of a world created and ordered by divine will. Through these stories, the landscape itself became a sacred text. Every mountain, lake, and stone could be read as part of the narrative of origins. Travellers across the empire could be reminded that their local huaycas were tied to the larger story of Viracocha and Inti, binding them symbolically to Cusco, even if they were politically resistant. This was a form of soft power, a way of shaping identity through myth as much as through conquest. The Incas were not unique in telling origin stories, but their ability to integrate myth with statecraft was extraordinary. In the highland environment, where the survival of communities depended on cooperation, these myths offered a framework for unity. They explained not only where the Incas came from, but why they ruled, why their temples stood at the center of the land, and why their commands carried the weight of divine authority. As their empire grew, these myths would be retold in new contexts, adapted to incorporate newly conquered regions, and reinterpreted by priests and rulers alike. Yet at their core, they always returned to the same figures: Viracocha, the creator, who shaped the world and gave it order, and Manco Capac with Mama Oclo, the first ancestors who founded Cusco and began the line of rulers that would one day command an empire stretching for thousands of kilometers along the spine of South America. The myths of origin thus prepared the stage for history itself. Out of the sacred waters and caves, from the guidance of gods and the struggles of ancestors, emerged a people who would transform the Andes. The Valley of Cusco, once a place where a golden staff sank into fertile earth, would soon become the heart of a civilization that built temples, roads, and armies. To understand how they rose from legend to empire, one must now follow their first steps as they began to establish themselves in that valley, shaping a settlement that would grow into the navel of the world. After the myths of origin, the world of the Incas shifts from the realm of divine beginnings into the traces of human settlement. The Valley of Cusco, where the golden staff of Manco Capac was said to have sunk into fertile earth, became the stage for the first community that would one day dominate the Andes. At the time of these early settlements, the Andes were not empty. Numerous groups already inhabited valleys, mountainsides, and riverbanks, each with their own traditions, languages, and ways of life. The people who would become known as the Incas were only one among many, a small group trying to carve out a place in a land already filled with competing interests. The archaeological record shows that Cusco Valley had long been a desirable place for human settlement. Its elevation at more than 3,000 meters made it cooler and less prone to tropical disease than the lowlands, while its rivers provided water for agriculture and its surrounding mountains created natural defences. Before the Incas, cultures such as the Quilca occupied the region around 1000 to 1200 CE. They built structures, practiced farming, and left behind pottery that reveals a society with connections to other Andean groups. The Quilca were not an empire but a local culture, yet their presence demonstrates that Cusco Valley had strategic importance long before it became the capital of a great empire. Into this setting, sometime in the early 1200s, came the ancestors of the Incas, whether they migrated from the region near Lake Titicaca or emerged from caves near Pacaratambo as the myths recount. What matters is that they established themselves in the valley and began to organize. At first, they were not rulers of all they surveyed. In fact, they were marginal compared to more established groups. Their earlier settlement was likely modest, composed of stone and adobe houses, clustered near arable land and water sources. The Incas themselves later remembered this period as one of struggle. Their oral traditions speak of conflicts with neighbouring groups who resisted their presence. The valley was fertile and contested, and every piece of land was valuable for cultivation. Early Inca leaders had to fight not only for survival but for recognition. The stories preserved in later chronicles describe these times as precarious, with alliances formed and broken, and with rival chiefs challenging Inca claims to territory. One of the most significant aspects of these early settlements was the gradual establishment of Cusco as a centre. The name itself, Cusco in Quechua, means navel, a term that reflects its eventual role as the symbolic centre of the world. At first, though, it was not a grand city, but a cluster of dwellings, fields, and shrines. The people who lived there built terraces to expand arable land, diverting water through canals to irrigate their crops. They cultivated maize, potatoes, and quinoa, staples that sustained Andean life. They raised llamas and alpacas for transport, wool, and meat. These practices, though modest in scale, provided the foundation for growth. Religion played an essential role from the very beginning. The Incas did not separate the sacred from the practical. Each settlement was also a religious space, tied to the landscape through huacas, sacred sites like rocks, springs, and caves. In Cusco Valley, certain mountains and rivers were seen as powerful guardians, and the Incas oriented their settlements in ways that connected daily life with spiritual protection. Later, when Cusco became the imperial capital, this connection would expand into a vast sacred geography, but its roots were already present in these first communities. The process of building a settlement was also the process of establishing authority. The leaders of these early Incas, remembered as the first rulers in dynastic lists, were both chiefs and priests. Their legitimacy came not only from their ability to organize labor and defend the community, but also from their claim to divine descent. By linking themselves to Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, they framed their leadership as part of a cosmic mandate. This connection to myth helped solidify their position in a competitive environment, where many groups vied for land and power. The structure of early Inca society reflected the Andean principle of Ailu, or kin-based community. Families grouped together into extended networks that shared land, labor, and responsibilities. Each Ailu traced its origins to a common ancestor, often tied to a specific huaca. In the early Inca settlements, Ailes provided the framework for social organization. Labor was coordinated through reciprocity, with families working together on fields, building terraces, and maintaining irrigation canals. In return, each member could count on the support of the group in times of need. This system was not unique to the Incas, but their ability to expand and adapt it on a larger scale would later become one of the keys to their empire. Conflict with neighbours remained constant. Chronicles describe battles with groups like the Ayamaca, who were powerful in the region. These struggles were not only about land, but also about prestige and the right to claim leadership. Warfare in the Andes at this time often involved raids, skirmishes, and displays of strength rather than large-scale battles. Capturing land, resources, and sometimes people was as important as outright destruction. For the early Incas, each victory helped secure their place in the valley, while each defeat risked pushing them back into obscurity. The archaeological remains from this period show traces of fortifications, suggesting that defence was a priority. Hilltops were fortified with walls and terraces, providing vantage points against potential attackers. These defensive works reveal a society that lived under the constant threat of conflict, but also one that learned to adapt its architecture to the demands of security. Over time, these skills in building strongholds would contribute to the Incas' reputation as master builders, capable of constructing fortresses like Sacsayhuaman that still astonish observers today. As generations passed, the settlement in Cusco grew in both size and importance. Houses multiplied, fields expanded, and religious ceremonies became more elaborate. The leadership began to formalize, with dynastic succession establishing continuity. Oral traditions preserve the names of early rulers, though their deeds are often mixed with legend. Figures such as Sinchi Roca, Loke Yupanqui, and Maita Capac appear in the lists of Inca kings, representing the gradual consolidation of power in Cusco. While it is difficult to separate myth from fact, what is clear is that the community was transforming from a marginal settlement into a recognized polity. Marriage alliances played a role in this growth. By intermarrying with leaders of neighboring groups, the early Incas extended their influence and secured peace where possible. These alliances created networks of loyalty that supported their expansion. At the same time, they maintained the principle of sibling marriage within the royal line, reinforcing their claim to divine descent while balancing the practical needs of diplomacy. This dual strategy of mythic legitimacy and political pragmatism became a hallmark of Inca statecraft. Agricultural innovations supported the settlement's growth. The Incas perfected the use of terraces, cutting steps into the mountainsides to create flat land for crops. These terraces not only expanded the area available for cultivation, but also conserved water and reduced erosion. By experimenting with different altitudes and microclimates, they developed a sophisticated understanding of how to maximize yields in a challenging environment. Storage facilities, or kolkhas, were constructed to preserve surplus harvests, ensuring food security during lean years. These practices allowed the population to grow, providing the manpower necessary for defense, construction, and ritual. Religion continued to evolve alongside political authority. The cult of Inti, the sun, gained prominence, symbolizing both agricultural fertility and the divine origin of the dynasty. Rituals honoring the sun became central to community life, reinforcing the link between rulers and cosmic order. At the same time, local huayzas remained important, maintaining the connection between the people and their specific landscapes. This combination of local and centralized religion would later become a powerful tool for integrating conquered peoples into the Inca state. As Cusco grew, its leaders began to envision it not only as a settlement but as a center. The valley's position in the highlands allowed for control over surrounding territories, and its fertile land provided a stable base. Over time, paths and roads connected it to neighboring regions, laying the groundwork for the vast network that the Incas would later construct. Each step in this process marked a shift from survival to ambition, from being one among many groups to aspiring to dominance. The early settlement period in Cusco was not marked by dramatic conquests or monumental architecture. Instead, it was a time of laying foundations, social, agricultural, religious, and political. These foundations were essential, because without them the later empire would not have been possible. The principles of Aliu organization, reciprocity, terrace farming, dynastic succession, and divine legitimacy all took root in these years. The people of Cusco learned to balance conflict with diplomacy, to integrate myth with governance, and to adapt their environment to their needs. Gradually, Cusco began to attract attention beyond its immediate valley. Traders and travelers carried news of its growing power. Religious ceremonies drew participants from surrounding regions. Marriages and alliances extended its influence. What had begun as a small settlement tied to mythic origins was transforming into a rising force. By the time later rulers like Pachacuti would emerge, Cusco was already primed to become the heart of an empire. The story of these first settlements is not one of sudden greatness, but of persistence. In the Andes, survival required resilience, and the Incas demonstrated that quality from the very beginning. Their early years were marked by struggle, adaptation, and gradual consolidation. Out of this process, Cusco emerged as a place unlike any other, a valley that would come to be seen as the navel of the world, the center from which power radiated across mountains, deserts, and coasts. To understand how this transformation unfolded further, it is necessary to follow the rulers who turned fragile beginnings into a dynasty, shaping the foundations of an empire that would one day stretch across the spine of South America. The transition from fragile beginnings in the Cusco Valley to the establishment of a dynasty marked the moment when the Incas began to transform from one group among many into a people with a vision of permanence. The early rulers who followed the mythic figures of Manco Capac and Mama Oclo were remembered as the founders of the line that would stretch across centuries, binding legend to history. Though the details of their lives remain blurred by oral tradition and later chronicles, the broad patterns show how the Incas laid down the structures of leadership, society, and religion that became the bedrock of their civilization. The list of early rulers, known as the Sapa Incas, is preserved in sources compiled after the Spanish conquest, and while their deeds are sometimes described in mythic tones, the sequence reflects the process of gradual consolidation in Cusco. After Manco Capac, figures such as Sinchiroca, Loke Yupanqui, and Maita Capac appear in the dynastic record. Each is remembered less for grand conquests than for establishing legitimacy, securing alliances, and fortifying Cusco's place in the regional landscape. Their reigns represent the slow work of statecraft before empire, the patient weaving of ties of kinship, ritual, and defense that would eventually give Cusco preeminence. Sinchiroca, traditionally remembered as the second ruler, is said to have been the first to establish a more formal seat of authority in Cusco. Accounts describe him marking boundaries, building simple structures, and beginning to shape the settlement into a recognizable center. The very act of defining territory was significant, because it turned Cusco from a cluster of families into a polity with recognized borders. His reign reflects the first step toward territorial control, even if limited to the valley itself. By embedding the dynasty in the soil of Cusco, he set a precedent that all future rulers would uphold. Lyoke Yupanqui, the third in the line, is portrayed as a figure who struggled to maintain control against stronger neighbours. His reign illustrates the precariousness of the dynasty's early years. Cusco was still small, and surrounding groups often outnumbered and outmatched the Incas. Warfare in this period was a matter of survival, not expansion. Chronicles describe raids, skirmishes, and occasional setbacks. Yet even in these difficulties the dynasty endured, holding its ground long enough to pass authority to the next generation. Continuity itself was an achievement, because it kept alive the narrative of divine descent and laid the groundwork for future expansion. Maita Capac, the fourth ruler, is remembered as a strong leader and skilled warrior. Oral traditions describe him as tall and formidable, with an appetite for military campaigns that took the Incas beyond their valley. Whether these accounts are literal or symbolic, they suggest that by his time the dynasty was beginning to look outward. Expansion was limited and often temporary, but the idea of pushing beyond Cusco took root. The memory of Maita Capac as a warrior reflects the growing importance of military strength in legitimizing rule. The Incas were learning that in a landscape of competing groups, power came not only from divine descent, but also from the ability to lead men in battle. Capac Yupanqui, who followed, is said to have extended Inca influence along trade routes, forging connections that reached toward the coast. Though Cusco remained a highland settlement, these links show how the dynasty was beginning to engage with the wider Andean world. Traders carried not only goods, but also news, ideas, and alliances. By tapping into these networks, the early Incas increased their visibility and began to project authority beyond their immediate valley. Trade in coca leaves, textiles, and precious metals brought wealth and prestige, strengthening the position of the ruling line. The reigns of later early rulers, such as Inca Roca and Yahuahuacac, illustrate the ongoing process of turning fragile power into something more enduring. Inca Roca is remembered as the founder of one of the major dynastic lineages within the Inca aristocracy, suggesting that by his time the ruling family had grown large enough to branch into multiple houses. This development points to increasing complexity in social organisation, with noble lineages forming around the central dynasty. These lineages provided the structure through which authority was shared and extended, allowing the rulers of Cusco to manage a growing population. The story of Yahuahuacas, the seventh ruler, reveals how myth and history intertwine in the memory of the dynasty. His name, which means he who weeps blood, comes from a tale that as a child he was kidnapped by enemies and rescued only after shedding tears of blood, a miraculous sign of his destined greatness. The legend reflects the dangers faced by Cusco in this period, when rival groups could threaten even the royal family, but it also reinforces the sense of divine protection over the dynasty. Surviving danger and humiliation only to triumph later became part of the narrative that legitimized Inca rule. What emerges from the stories of these early rulers is not the image of a conquering empire, but of a dynasty learning to endure, adapt, and project authority. Each generation faced the dual challenges of survival and legitimacy. Survival required military strength, diplomacy, and resource management. Legitimacy required ties to mythic origins, ritual authority, and the ability to present themselves as chosen by the gods. By combining these elements, the rulers of Cusco gradually transformed their settlement into the heart of a polity that others could not ignore. The foundations of the dynasty were also built in stone. Archaeological evidence shows that during these early generations, Cusco began to take shape as a planned settlement. Walls of finely cut stone, though less monumental than those of later times, reveal a growing mastery of masonry. The layout of the city began to reflect symbolic and practical considerations, with spaces for ritual, governance, and residence. Each construction project reinforced the authority of the dynasty, demonstrating its capacity to organize labor and transform the landscape. Religion was central to this process. The rulers of Cusco expanded the cult of Inti, the sun, positioning themselves as children of the sun and intermediaries between heaven and earth. They also respected and incorporated local huacas, acknowledging the sacred sites of conquered or allied groups. This dual strategy allowed them to strengthen their central cult while maintaining ties with diverse communities. By creating a religious system that combined universal and local elements, the early Incas laid the groundwork for the spiritual integration of a vast empire. Social organization also advanced during this period. The Elu system, already the backbone of Andean society, was adapted to serve the needs of the dynasty. Land was distributed among Elus, who cultivated it collectively and contributed labor to public works and rituals. In return, the ruling line ensured protection, coordination, and ceremonial leadership. This reciprocal relationship deepened loyalty and bound the people of Cusco more closely to their rulers. As the dynasty grew in strength, these practices would expand outward, forming the basis of the empire's economic and social system. Marriage alliances further cemented power. The rulers of Cusco married strategically, linking their line to influential families in surrounding regions. These alliances created bonds of obligation that could be activated in times of war or diplomacy. At the same time, sibling marriage within the royal family preserved the sacred nature of the dynasty, reinforcing its claim to divine descent. The balance between outward alliances and inward purity of blood became a defining feature of Inca nobility. By the time of Viracocha Inca, often remembered as the eighth ruler, the dynasty had moved beyond mere survival. His reign marked a turning point, when Cusco began to assert dominance more decisively over its neighbours. He is remembered for reorganising the city, expanding its territory, and strengthening its institutions. The fact that later rulers, including his famous son Pachacuti, looked back to him as a significant figure shows how the dynasty by then had matured into a true regional power. Viracocha Inca's reign represents the culmination of the foundational period, the point at which Cusco was no longer simply defending itself but actively shaping the political landscape of the Andes. The foundations of the Inca dynasty were therefore laid over generations of rulers who combined myth with pragmatism, religion with politics, and survival with ambition. Each contributed to the slow transformation of Cusco from a vulnerable settlement into a recognized center of power. The dynasty's continuity, its ability to pass authority from one ruler to the next despite threats and challenges, was itself a remarkable achievement. In the Andes, where many groups rose and fell, the Incas endured, and in enduring they prepared the way for empire. This early period is often overshadowed by the later conquests and monumental achievements of the Inca state, but without it the empire would never have been possible. The principles established in these generations, the sanctity of the royal line, the cult of the sun, the integration of local traditions, the organization of Elus, the importance of alliances and the role of stone architecture, were the seeds from which all later growth would emerge. From these foundations, the stage was set for one of the most transformative rulers in Andean history. Out of the line of Viracocha Inca would come Pachacuti, the visionary who would reshape Cusco and launch the expansion that turned a regional power into an empire. But before his reign could unfold, the dynasty had to be secured, the city had to be built, and the traditions had to be established. The Incas had laid their groundwork, and now the Andes awaited the moment when their ambitions would burst beyond the valley and sweep across mountains, deserts, and coasts. the battle against the Incas became legendary. Chronicles describe how Pachacuti invoked the gods, calling upon the stones themselves to rise and fight on his behalf. In these stories, boulders came alive, hurling themselves against the enemy and scattering them in terror. Whether literal or symbolic, the tale captures the sense of miraculous deliverance that surrounded his victory. In practical terms, it demonstrated his skill as a commander and his ability to inspire loyalty. The defense of Cusco not only saved the dynasty, but also revealed Cusi Yupanqui as the true leader. After this triumph, he took the name Pachacuti, meaning world transformer or earthshaker, a title that reflected both his military achievement and his broader vision for the future. Once he secured the throne, Pachacuti set about reshaping Cusco into the heart of an empire. He understood that military power alone would not sustain expansion. The city itself had to reflect the grandeur and authority of the dynasty. He reorganized its layout, designing it in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal associated with strength and power. The head of the puma was the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, the body was the central city, and the tail extended into the surrounding valley. This symbolic design transformed Cusco into a sacred landscape, a living image of cosmic order that reinforced the Incas' claim to divine authority. The construction projects Pachacuti initiated were monumental. The battle against the Chansa became legendary. Chronicles describe how Pachacuti invoked the gods, calling upon the stones themselves to rise and fight on his behalf. In these stories, boulders came alive, hurling themselves against the enemy and scattering them in terror. Whether literal or symbolic, the tale captures the sense of miraculous deliverance that surrounded his victory. In practical terms, it demonstrated his skill as a commander and his ability to inspire loyalty. The defense of Cusco not only saved the dynasty, but also revealed Cusi Yupanqui as the true leader. After this triumph, he took the name Pachacuti, meaning world transformer or earthshaker, a title that reflected both his military achievement and his broader vision for the future. Once he secured the throne, Pachacuti set about reshaping Cusco into the heart of an empire. He understood that military power alone would not sustain expansion. The city itself had to reflect the grandeur and authority of the dynasty. He reorganized its layout, designing it in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal associated with strength and power. The head of the puma was the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, the body was the central city, and the tail extended into the surrounding valley. This symbolic design transformed Cusco into a sacred landscape, a living image of cosmic order that reinforced the Incas' claim to divine authority. The construction projects Pachacuti initiated were monumental. He expanded the great temple of Coricancha, dedicated to Inti, the sun god, covering its walls with sheets of gold that reflected the brilliance of the sun itself. He commissioned palaces, plazas, and administrative buildings, turning Cusco into a city that awed visitors. The labour required for these projects was immense, but Pachacuti mobilized it through the system of reciprocal obligations that formed the core of Inca society. Communities contributed workers, who in return were sustained and honoured by the state. The transformation of Cusco was thus both a physical and a social achievement, binding the people more closely to the dynasty through shared labour and ritual. Pachacuti's vision extended beyond the city. He reorganized the Inca state itself, creating structures that allowed for efficient governance of newly conquered territories. He divided the empire into 4 suyus, or quarters, radiating outward from Cusco like the arms of a great cross. Together these quarters formed Tawantinsuyu, the land of the 4 parts together. This system gave the empire both symbolic unity and practical order, ensuring that every region was tied directly to the centre. Roads linked the quarters, allowing for communication, movement of armies, and transportation of goods. By imposing this structure, Pachacuti transformed a regional kingdom into a coherent imperial system. The military campaigns that followed his rise were relentless. With Cusco secure, he turned outward, leading armies across the Andes to bring surrounding groups under Inca control. The victories piled up quickly, extending Inca influence far beyond the valley. The strategy combined force with diplomacy. Conquered peoples were offered a place within the empire, allowed to keep their local leaders and traditions as long as they acknowledged Inca authority, paid tribute, and provided labour. Resistance was met with overwhelming military power, but cooperation brought security and benefits. This approach allowed Pachacuti to expand rapidly, incorporating diverse groups without destroying their identities. One of Pachacuti's most enduring policies was the practice of mitmac, or resettlement. To prevent rebellion and encourage integration, he ordered populations to be moved from one region to another. Skilled workers, artisans, and farmers were relocated to areas where their talents could be used, while potentially rebellious groups were dispersed to weaken their resistance. This policy spread knowledge and skills across the empire, creating a more interconnected society. It also reinforced the idea that the empire was a single entity, not just a collection of conquered lands. Though disruptive, the mitmac system was crucial in maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory. Pachacuti's reign also saw the expansion of agriculture and infrastructure. He promoted the construction of terraces on a massive scale, turning mountainsides into staircases of fertile land. Canals and aqueducts extended irrigation, increasing productivity and supporting a growing population. Storage facilities were built throughout the empire to hold surplus food, ensuring stability in times of famine or drought. These innovations not only strengthened the economy, but also demonstrated the benevolence of the state, which could provide for its people even in times of hardship. Religion under Pachacuti became more centralized. While local gods and wakas continued to be honored, the cult of Inti was elevated above all others. The sun was proclaimed the supreme deity, and the Sapa Inca, as the child of the sun, was positioned as the ultimate authority. This religious hierarchy mirrored the political structure of the empire, reinforcing the idea that obedience to the Inca was obedience to the cosmic order itself. Pachacuti also encouraged the worship of Viracocha, the creator god, integrating the older myth into the imperial system. By combining universal deities with local traditions, he created a religious framework that unified the empire while respecting its diversity. The intellectual and artistic life of the empire flourished under Pachacuti. He is credited with promoting the development of the quipu, the knotted string system used for record keeping. Through quepus, administrators tracked population, tribute and resources, allowing for efficient management across vast distances. He also encouraged poetry, songs and oral traditions that celebrated Inca victories and glorified the dynasty. Architecture, sculpture and textiles reached new heights of sophistication, blending artistry with practicality. Every aspect of culture was harnessed to reinforce the image of the empire as strong, orderly, and divinely sanctioned. Pachacuti's legacy is perhaps most vividly embodied in the creation of Machu Picchu, the royal estate he built high in the mountains. Though its exact purpose remains debated, it reflects the combination of power, spirituality, and connection to the landscape that defined his reign. The site's terraces, temples, and residences demonstrate extraordinary engineering, adapted perfectly to the rugged terrain. Its location, surrounded by peaks and often shrouded in mist, conveys a sense of sacred isolation. Whether it served as a retreat, a ceremonial centre, or both, Machu Picchu symbolizes Pachacuti's ability to shape the world according to his vision. What sets Pachacuti apart is not simply his conquests, but the way he redefined the very concept of rulership. He saw the Sapa Inca not merely as a local chief or king, but as the embodiment of cosmic order, the centre around which the entire Andean world revolved. His reforms in government, religion, architecture, and social organisation created a model that endured long after his death. Later rulers built upon his foundations, but it was Pachacuti who first imagined the empire as something more than a collection of territories, For him, it was a living whole, bound together by roads, rituals, and the authority of Cusco. As he aged, Pachacuti ensured that succession would be secure, grooming his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui to continue the work of expansion. The continuity of leadership ensured that the momentum he created would not be lost. When Pachacuti eventually died, his mummified body was preserved and honoured, treated as a continuing presence in the affairs of the state. In Inca belief, rulers never truly left. Their ancestors lived on in mummies that were consulted, honoured and paraded in ceremonies. Pachacuti's body remained a source of legitimacy, a reminder that the world transformer had reshaped the Andes forever. The scale of change brought about during his reign cannot be overstated. Before Pachacuti, Cusco was a vulnerable city, struggling for survival. After him, it was the radiant centre of Tawantinsuyu, a city that embodied the cosmic order and projected power across mountains, valleys and coasts. His vision turned fragile foundations into a vast imperial structure, one that stretched thousands of kilometres and encompassed millions of people. Though later rulers would extend and maintain it, the essence of the Inca Empire was Pachacuti's creation. The story of Pachacuti leads naturally into the expansion that followed, as his successors carried the empire farther than he could have imagined in his early days. Roads would extend across deserts and jungles, armies would march into new lands, and the structures he designed would prove resilient against time and change. The Incas had become more than a people of Cusco. They had become the rulers of an empire whose reach and organisation were unlike anything the Andes had seen before. From this point, the history of the Incas is no longer about survival, but about mastery, about how they built, ruled, and sustained one of the most extraordinary civilizations in the world. With Pachacuti's vision firmly imprinted on Cusco and the imperial structure beginning to take shape, the Incas entered a new era defined not only by defense and consolidation, but by sweeping campaigns of conquest that carried their authority across the Andes. What began as a regional kingdom grew under his leadership and that of his successors into Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four parts together, a vast empire stretching thousands of kilometres from north to south. The Andes, with their dizzying heights, narrow valleys and unforgiving deserts, might have seemed to outsiders like an insurmountable barrier to such ambitions, but for the Incas, they became the very framework upon which an empire was built. The expansion began with a mixture of necessity and opportunity. Cusco, though fortified and transformed, could not sustain itself without control over the fertile valleys and strategic routes beyond its immediate surroundings. Neighbouring groups remained potential threats, and leaving them independent meant risking renewed attacks. At the same time, Pachacuti and the Inca leadership had forged a new conception of rulership. They no longer saw themselves as one polity among many, but as the axis of the world chosen to bring order to the Andes. Expansion was therefore not only pragmatic, but ideological, a fulfillment of their divine mandate. The campaigns unfolded in stages, each extending Inca influence farther outward. The first targets were neighbouring groups in the highlands who had long contested control of fertile land and trade routes. The Incas deployed armies organised with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers were drawn from Alis, summoned through obligations of service, and supplied through the state's growing storage system. Commanders coordinated their movements using the network of messengers, the chasqui, who carried information along roads at astonishing speed. Victories over these nearby rivals secured Cusco's immediate region and provided a base for further campaigns. Once the local threats were subdued, the Incas turned their attention to more distant lands. The conquest of the Chanca, which had marked Pachacuti's rise, was followed by campaigns against the Colla to the south near Lake Titicaca. The Colla controlled fertile lands and herds of llamas and alpacas, essential resources for the empire. Bringing them under Inca control not only expanded the territory, but also secured crucial supplies. The defeat of the Colla demonstrated that the Incas could impose their authority over powerful and established groups, setting a precedent for the future. Expansion was not accomplished solely through force. Diplomacy and integration played central roles. Conquered peoples were often offered the chance to submit peacefully, retaining their local leaders and traditions as long as they acknowledged Inca supremacy, paid tribute, and provided labour. This approach reduced resistance and allowed the empire to grow without constant rebellion. The Incas presented themselves as civilizers, bringers of order and prosperity, who would incorporate local gods into the wider pantheon and provide stability in exchange for loyalty. By offering both incentives and overwhelming force, they created a system that drew diverse groups into a common framework. One of the tools of expansion was the policy of resettlement, or mitmac. After conquering a region, the Incas would often move portions of its population to other areas, dispersing potential rebels and bringing skilled workers to places where their talents were needed. In return, loyal subjects might be resettled into newly conquered territories, helping to establish Inca authority. This policy both weakened resistance and spread knowledge across the empire, creating a more interconnected society. Though disruptive to communities, it ensured that no region remained isolated or fully independent of Cusco's influence. The Incas also relied on the symbolism of ritual and myth to integrate new lands. Local huaycas were respected and incorporated into the imperial religion, but they were often subordinated to the cult of Inti, the sun god. Temples dedicated to the sun were established in conquered regions, linking them to the Coricancha in Cusco, the central temple of the empire. Festivals and ceremonies reinforced the connection between local communities and the imperial centre. By weaving religion into the fabric of conquest, the Incas gave spiritual legitimacy to their expansion. The geographical challenges of the Andes shaped the nature of these campaigns. Unlike the flat plains of Mesopotamia or the river valleys of Egypt, the Andes presented extreme variations in altitude and climate over short distances. Armies had to march across snow-capped mountains, descend into deep valleys, and traverse arid deserts. The ability of the Incas to adapt to these environments was crucial. They built roads and bridges, carved terraces into steep slopes, and established supply depots to sustain their forces. These logistical achievements were as important as battlefield victories, allowing the empire to project power across terrain that would have defeated less organised societies. The role of the army became central to the identity of the empire. Soldiers were not professional in the sense of permanent standing troops, but every able-bodied man owed military service to the state through the emitter system. This meant that the Incas could mobilise vast numbers of troops when needed, drawing from the populations of conquered regions. Commanders were selected for their loyalty and skill, and the army was equipped with weapons suited to the environment. Slings capable of hurling stones with deadly force, spears, clubs, and armour of padded cotton or metal. The combination of numbers, organisation, and adaptability gave the Incas a decisive advantage over their rivals. As expansion continued, the empire extended northward into present-day Ecuador and southward into present-day Chile and Argentina. Each conquest added new resources, new peoples, and new challenges. In Ecuador, the Incas encountered societies with their own traditions of resistance and had to fight prolonged campaigns to secure control. In Chile, they pushed into regions of arid desert and fertile valleys, adapting their strategies to unfamiliar environments. The sheer diversity of the lands they incorporated demonstrated the flexibility of their system. One of the striking aspects of Inca expansion was the way they balanced uniformity with diversity. On one hand, they imposed common structures, the division into suyos, the construction of roads, the collection of tribute, the use of quipas for record-keeping, and the centrality of the sun cult. On the other hand, they allowed local customs, languages, and traditions to persist, as long as they did not threaten imperial authority. This balance made the empire both cohesive and adaptable, capable of holding together a population of millions across thousands of kilometres. The role of Pachacuti in this process was foundational, but he did not act alone. His son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, became the principal general of the empire, leading campaigns that extended its reach even further. Together they created a system where expansion was not a temporary burst of conquest, but a sustained process supported by institutions, infrastructure and ideology. Each victory was consolidated through the building of roads, the establishment of administrative centres, and the integration of local elites into the imperial system. The image of the Sapa Inca as the axis of the world reinforced this process. Conquered peoples were taught to see Cusco as the navel of the earth, the place from which order radiated. Tribute flowed into the city, not just in material goods, but in labour, knowledge, and symbolic recognition. The empire became a living embodiment of the principle of reciprocity, with the ruler providing protection, infrastructure, and festivals in return for loyalty and service. This ideological framework made conquest appear not simply as domination, but as inclusion into a higher order. The pace of expansion was breathtaking. Within a few generations, the Incas had created an empire stretching more than 4,000 kilometres along the spine of South America. The scale rivaled that of Rome, yet achieved without wheels, iron, or written language. Instead, the Incas relied on their mastery of the environment, their organizational genius, and their ability to harness human labor on an unprecedented scale. Each new conquest was a test of this system, and each success reinforced the legitimacy of the empire. As the empire expanded, challenges also grew. Maintaining control over such vast distances required constant vigilance. Rebellions had to be suppressed, roads maintained, and administrators kept loyal. The system of resettlement and integration was designed to address these challenges, but it required constant effort. The Incas responded by creating layers of authority, appointing governors, and building administrative centres that mirrored Cusco in miniature. These centres served as nodes of control, linking distant regions to the capital through both practical governance and symbolic ritual. The period of conquest across the Andes thus represents the moment when the Incas fully embraced their role as empire builders. They were no longer merely defending Cusco or asserting dominance over neighbours. They were reshaping the political, social and religious landscape of the Andes, incorporating diverse peoples into a single system that radiated from Cusco. The foundations laid by Pachacuti and expanded by his successors created a structure that was at once fragile and resilient, held together by roads, rituals, and the shared recognition of the Sapa Inca as the child of the sun. The story of expansion naturally leads to the achievements that sustained it. The roads, bridges, and architectural marvels that connected the empire, the administrative systems that managed its resources, and the cultural practices that gave it cohesion. The conquest of the Andes was not only about armies marching and battles won, it was about building the infrastructure and ideology that made such an empire possible. From here, the narrative turns to those achievements, to the roads that threaded through mountains and valleys, to the bridges that spanned gorges, and to the engineering that allowed the Incas to command the Andes as no people had before. The expansion of the Inca Empire across the Andes would not have been possible without the astonishing network of infrastructure that bound its vast and diverse territories together. Mountains, valleys, deserts, and rivers that might have isolated communities from one another instead became part of an interconnected system, carefully planned and maintained by the state. At the heart of this system was a road network so extensive and so sophisticated that it remains one of the marvels of pre-Columbian engineering. Alongside these roads, bridges spanned gorges, staircases climbed cliffs, and storehouses dotted the landscape, forming the arteries through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. To travel the length of the empire was to move along paths that carried armies, administrators, goods, messages, and rituals, each reinforcing the unity of Tawantinsuyu. The Inca road system, known collectively as the Chapac Ñan or the Great Road, stretched more than 40,000 kilometres, covering distances that linked the farthest reaches of the empire. Two main highways ran the length of Tawantinsuyu, one through the highlands, tracing the backbone of the Andes, and the other along the coast. These main arteries were connected by a web of secondary routes that reached into valleys, across deserts, and into remote mountain settlements. The scale of the project is staggering, especially considering that the Incas built it without wheels, iron tools, or draft animals capable of pulling heavy loads. Llamas carried burdens, but it was human labour that carved, paved, and maintained the network. Each road was adapted to its environment. In flat valleys, they were wide and paved with stone, sometimes lined with walls to mark their course. In mountainous regions, the roads became narrow paths cut into cliffsides, supported by retaining walls that prevented erosion. Where rivers cut across their path, the Incas constructed causeways and bridges. Where the land rose steeply, they built staircases, each step carved or laid with stone to ease the climb. In deserts, where shifting sands might obscure the route, they marked the way with posts or built raised causeways to keep the road visible. This adaptability allowed the roads to cross some of the most challenging terrain in the world. The purpose of the roads was not simply to connect places, but to bind them into a single system under Cusco. Messengers known as chasqui ran along the roads, carrying information between distant regions and the capital. These runners worked in relays, stationed at intervals of a few kilometres. Each chasqui would sprint with a quipu or a verbal message, hand it off to the next runner and rest. In this way, information could travel astonishingly fast. Messages could move hundreds of kilometres in a single day, allowing the Sapa Inca to communicate with distant governors and commanders. The speed of this system rivaled that of courier services in much more technologically advanced societies. The roads also supported the movement of armies. The Inca military machine depended on the ability to mobilize large numbers of soldiers and move them quickly to trouble spots. The road network ensured that armies could march across the empire with relative ease, supplied by storehouses along the way. When rebellions broke out or external threats emerged, the Incas could respond with speed and overwhelming force. The roads turned the vast distances of the Andes from obstacles into channels of control, allowing Cusco to project power far beyond its valley. Storehouses, or kolkas, were a crucial part of this system. Built along the roads and near settlements, these structures stored maize, potatoes, quinoa, dried meat, textiles, weapons, and other supplies. Designed with ventilation to preserve food, they allowed the state to maintain reserves that could be distributed in times of famine, drought, or war. The existence of these storehouses gave the Inca administration a degree of stability and resilience unmatched by many pre-modern states. They also demonstrated the reciprocity at the heart of the Inca system. Communities contributed labour and goods, but in return, the state ensured their survival in times of crisis. Among the most remarkable achievements of Inca engineering were their bridges. The Andes are cut by countless deep gorges, where rivers flow far below sheer cliffs. To cross these chasms, the Incas constructed suspension bridges made of braided plant fibres, sometimes spanning distances of up to 45 metres. These bridges were strong enough to support the passage of people, animals, and goods, yet they required constant maintenance. Communities were assigned responsibility for rebuilding them every year or two, ensuring that the network remained intact. The sight of such a bridge, swaying above a roaring river, must have been both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Even today, reconstructed Inca bridges continue to be used in some regions, a living testament to their ingenuity. In addition to suspension bridges, the Incas built simple log bridges, stone causeways, and floating reed platforms, adapting their techniques to the conditions they faced. In places where cliffs were too steep for roads, they carved staircases directly into the rock, creating vertical pays that clung to mountainsides. The determination to connect every part of the empire, no matter how remote or difficult, speaks to the organizational drive that characterized Inca rule. For the Incas, geography was not an obstacle, but a challenge to be mastered. The symbolic significance of the road system was as important as its practical function, Roads radiated from Cusco, reinforcing the idea that it was the centre of the world, the navel from which order extended outward. Travelling along the roads, people moved not only through space but also through a hierarchy of power, constantly reminded of their connection to the imperial centre. Roads were places of ritual as well as travel. Ceremonial processions, military parades, and pilgrimages all moved along them, turning the act of walking into an affirmation of imperial unity. The construction and maintenance of the roads relied on the Meta system, the organised labour service that was one of the pillars of the Inca state. Communities provided workers who cleared, repaired, and built roads and bridges, receiving in return the protection and benefits of the empire. This labour was not seen simply as exploitation, but as part of the reciprocal relationship between the people and the state. The roads were therefore both a practical infrastructure and a social contract, binding communities into the imperial system through shared effort. The engineering of the roads reveals a profound understanding of the Andean environment. Retaining walls stabilised slopes, drainage channels prevented flooding, and paving stones reduced erosion. In some places, roads were built to allow water to pass underneath, avoiding damage during heavy rains. The care with which they were constructed ensured that many sections remain visible and usable even today, centuries after the fall of the empire. The durability of the system is a testament to the skill and vision of the engineers who designed it. The presence of roads and bridges also facilitated cultural exchange within the empire. Traders, artisans, and pilgrims travelled along them, carrying goods, ideas, and traditions. Languages, rituals, and technologies spread more easily, creating a sense of shared identity across diverse regions. While the Inca administration imposed order from above, the roads created the conditions for a more organic integration, where people encountered one another and shared their lives across distances that would otherwise have remained isolated. The sheer scale of the road system impressed even the Spanish conquerors, who marvelled at its extent and quality. They compared it to the roads of Rome, recognising that it represented a level of organisation and ambition equal to the greatest empires of the Old World. For the Incas, however, the roads were not merely practical achievements, but manifestations of their vision of a unified world. They embodied the principle that Cusco was the centre of a vast order, and that the empire was not a patchwork of territories, but a single, living entity, held together by stone, fibre, and human effort. The mastery of engineering extended beyond roads and bridges to include terraces, canals, aqueducts, and other projects that transformed the landscape. The Incas were not content to adapt to their environment. They reshaped it to suit their needs. By carving the mountains into steps, channeling water into dry valleys, and linking distant regions with roads, they turned the Andes into a habitable and productive space on a scale that astonished outsiders. Their achievements in engineering were inseparable from their achievements in governance, for the ability to mobilize labour and coordinate projects was both a technical and a political triumph. The story of the Inca roads and bridges is therefore the story of the empire itself. It is a story of vision, organisation, adaptation, and reciprocity. It is a story of how a people without wheels, iron, or beasts of burden beyond the llama created one of the most sophisticated transportation networks in human history. It is a story of how geography, once a barrier, became the backbone of a civilization. And it is a story that leads naturally to the sacred spaces the Incas built along these roads, the cities that served as both practical centres of administration and spiritual centres of the cosmos. Among them, Cusco, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu stood out as embodiments of Inca genius, places where stone and spirit came together to express the grandeur of Tawantinsuyu. The expansion of the Inca Empire and the mastery of roads, bridges and engineering naturally found their fullest expression in the cities the Incas built and sanctified. These were not merely places to live, govern, or trade, but living embodiments of their worldview, where political authority, religious devotion and cosmic order were fused into stone. Among the many settlements that dotted the empire, 3 stand above all as the quintessential expressions of Inca civilization. Cusco, the imperial capital and the navel of the world; Ollantaytambo, a fortress, administrative hub, and symbol of resistance; and Machu Picchu, the enigmatic royal estate nestled high in the mountains, where stone and landscape blended into a single vision of sacred harmony. Together, they reveal not only the technical brilliance of the Incas, but also their ability to transform geography into theology and architecture into a language of power. Cusco, the heart of Tawantinsuyu, was more than a city. It was a cosmic diagram carved into the earth, designed to embody the empire's spiritual and political order. Reorganized by Pachacuti after his rise to power, Cusco was laid out in the shape of a puma, an animal revered for its strength and agility. The head of this puma was the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, perched on a hill overlooking the city, while the body spread across the valley floor in a complex of palaces, plazas, and temples. The tail extended into the surrounding lands, binding the city to its environment. For the Incas, this design was not decorative but symbolic, a way of inscribing cosmic meaning onto the physical landscape. At the centre of Cusco stood the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, the most sacred site in the empire. Its walls were lined with sheets of gold, reflecting the brilliance of Inti, the sun god, whose cult formed the heart of Inca religion. Within its chambers stood golden idols, images of the sun, and representations of other deities incorporated into the imperial pantheon. Ceremonies held here reaffirmed the divine connection between the Sapa Inca and the cosmic order. To enter the Coricancha was to step into the axis of the world, the place where heaven and earth converged through ritual and architecture. Surrounding the Coricancha and spreading outward were the palaces of the Inca rulers. Each Sapa Inca built his own palace during his reign, which remained the residence of his lineage after his death. These palaces were more than dwellings. They were centres of administration, ceremony and memory. Together, they created a city where every street, every courtyard, and every plaza was tied to the lineage of rulers and to the unfolding of history itself. The palaces, along with the Coricancha, turned Cusco into a living archive of dynastic power, with each generation adding its own chapter in stone. The roads of the empire all converged on Cusco, reinforcing its status as the navel of the world. From its plazas radiated the 4 suyus, the quarters of the empire, each represented by processional routes that tied distant regions to the capital. The city was not only a political hub but also a spiritual one, where representatives of conquered peoples came to participate in festivals, ceremonies, and rituals. Inti Raymi, the great festival of the sun, was celebrated here with processions, sacrifices, and offerings, drawing participants from across Tawantinsuyu. Through such gatherings, Cusco became the physical and symbolic centre of an empire that stretched across mountains, deserts, and coasts. While Cusco embodied the imperial order at its centre, Ollantaytambo represented both the reach of that order and the resilience of its people. Located in the sacred valley, Ollantaytambo was both a fortress and a ceremonial site. Its terraces rise steeply from the valley floor, creating an imposing wall of stone that testifies to the Incas' mastery of both engineering and defence. The site was strategically placed to control access to the valley and to serve as a stronghold against external threats. Its construction, attributed to Pachacuti and his successors, reflects the dual purpose of Inca architecture: practical defence and symbolic power. The terraces of Ollantaytambo are among the most impressive in the Andes. They climb the mountainside in massive steps, each one supported by carefully fitted stone walls. These terraces served both agricultural and defensive functions, providing space for crops while also forming barriers against attackers. At the top of the terraces stood ceremonial structures, including the unfinished Sun Temple, where massive stones were carved and placed with extraordinary precision. Some of these stones, weighing many tons, were transported from quarries several kilometres away a feat that required immense labour and coordination. The effort invested in Ollantaytambo demonstrates the importance of the site as both a practical and sacred space. Ollantaytambo also holds a unique place in the story of resistance. After the Spanish conquest, it became a stronghold for Manco Inca, one of the last leaders of the Inca resistance. From its terraces, his forces fought Spanish soldiers, using the site's strategic position to hold off superior weaponry for a time. Though ultimately the resistance was forced to retreat, Ollantaytambo stands as a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the empire's spirit did not vanish quietly. Even in its role as a fortress of resistance, the city reflected the enduring strength of Inca architecture and the determination of its people. If Cusco was the imperial centre and Ollantaytambo the stronghold of both power and defiance, Machu Picchu was the vision of Inca sacredness realised in isolation. Perched high in the mountains, shrouded in mist and surrounded by peaks, Machu Picchu was built as a royal estate for Pachacuti, yet it also functioned as a ceremonial site deeply tied to the natural world. Its terraces, temples and residences form a city that seems to grow organically from the mountain itself, blending human construction with the contours of the landscape. Unlike Cusco, which bustled with administration, or Ollantaytambo, which bristled with defence, Machu Picchu appears to have been a place of retreat, ritual and reflection. The design of Machu Picchu reveals an extraordinary sensitivity to both spiritual symbolism and environmental adaptation. Its main plaza separates the agricultural sector from the urban sector, creating a balance between the practical and the sacred. Within the urban sector, temples and ritual spaces dominate. The Temple of the Sun, with its rounded walls and carefully aligned windows, was positioned to capture the rays of the sun at key moments of the year, marking solstices and equinoxes. The Intihuatana, or hitching post of the sun, is a carved stone that appears to have functioned as an astronomical marker, aligning with the movements of the sun and reinforcing the city's role as a place where cosmic order was observed and honoured. The terraces of Machu Picchu, like those of Ollantaytambo, demonstrate the Incas' mastery of agriculture in difficult environments. Carved into steep slopes, they prevented erosion, conserved water, and created fertile land for crops. Combined with the natural springs that flowed through the site, these terraces sustained the community and symbolised the harmonious integration of human labour with the natural world. Every stone, every channel, every terrace at Machu Picchu reflects this union of practicality and spirituality, a union that defined the Inca worldview. The purpose of Machu Picchu has long been debated. Some scholars see it primarily as a royal estate, a retreat for Pachacuti and his court where he could escape the bustle of Cusco and enjoy the beauty of the mountains. Others emphasize its religious significance, suggesting that it was a pilgrimage site, a place where rituals connected the empire to the sacred peaks and rivers of the region. Still others see it as an administrative centre, though its remote location makes this less likely. Perhaps it was all of these at once, for in the Inca world the boundaries between politics, religion and daily life were never rigid. A royal estate could also be a temple, and a temple could also be a symbol of imperial power. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu in the early 20th century brought it worldwide fame, but for the Incas it was never forgotten. Though hidden from Spanish eyes, it remained part of the sacred geography of the Andes, remembered in local traditions and connected to the larger network of huacas and pilgrimage routes. Its endurance as a symbol of Inca genius speaks to the timeless quality of its design, where stone, mountain and sky converge in a vision of sacred order. Taken together, Cusco, Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu reveal the range and depth of Inca architecture and urban planning. Each city reflects a different aspect of the empire, Cusco as the political and spiritual centre, Ollantaytambo as the fortress of power and resistance, and Machu Picchu as the retreat into sacred isolation. Yet all three share common features: the precision of stonework, the integration with the landscape, the balance of practicality and spirituality, and the expression of imperial authority through architecture. They embody the Inca ability to turn geography into theology, to make the very mountains speak of order, power, and divine sanction. The sacred cities were not isolated monuments, but part of the larger network of roads, bridges, and storage systems that bound the empire together. Pilgrims travelled along the Chapakñan to reach them, carrying offerings and participating in rituals. Messengers ran between them, carrying news and commands. Armies marched through them, securing the empire's hold. Each city was both unique and part of the whole, a node in the great web of Tawantinsuyu that radiated from Cusco. To walk through their plazas, to climb their terraces, to stand before their temples was to experience the empire not just as political power, but as a sacred order inscribed in stone. The grandeur of these cities leads naturally into the heart of Inca belief, for architecture and religion were inseparable. The walls of the Coricancha, the terraces of Ollantaytambo, and the temples of Machu Picchu were not only feats of engineering but also spaces where humans connected with the gods, where rituals bound communities together, and where the Sapa Inca affirmed his role as the child of the sun. To understand the true meaning of these sacred cities, one must turn to the religion that animated them, the worship of the sun, the reverence for the mountains, and the vision of a cosmos alive with spirit. Religion was not a separate sphere of life in the Inca world. It was the very framework within which every action, every ritual, and every decision took place. From the planting of crops to the waging of war, from the construction of terraces to the coronation of rulers, all was done with the gods in mind and in accordance with a cosmic order that governed the universe. The Incas did not see themselves as simply managing an empire. They saw themselves as caretakers of a sacred balance between the heavens, the earth, and humanity. To live in Tawantinsuyu was to live inside a system where sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers and ancestors were alive, present, and demanding of reverence. At the centre of this religious vision stood Inti, the sun god. He was the great source of warmth and light, the giver of life, the force that made crops grow and herds multiply. The Incas declared themselves his children, with the Sapa Inca presented as the literal son of Inti, ruling by divine right. This relationship to the sun was not abstract. It was made visible in temples lined with gold, in rituals timed to the movements of the heavens, and in the daily prayers of the people. The Coricancha in Cusco, lined with sheets of gold to reflect the sun's brilliance, was the physical embodiment of this devotion. When the rays of the sun fell upon its golden walls, it was as if Inti himself was present, blessing his people and affirming the authority of his child on earth. Yet Inca religion was never limited to the sun alone. The cosmos was understood as a layered and interconnected whole, with multiple deities, spirits, and forces working together. Viracocha, the creator god, remained a central figure, remembered as the one who had shaped the world, brought forth the sun, moon, and stars, and given laws to humanity. Though often portrayed as distant, Viracocha represented the ultimate source of order, and the Incas invoked him as a way of connecting their rule to the very act of creation. Alongside Inti and Viracocha, the moon goddess Mamaquila played a vital role. She governed the cycles of time, the rhythms of months, and the fertility of women. Her phases marked the calendar, guiding rituals and planting cycles. Temples dedicated to her stood alongside those of the sun, reflecting the balance between male and female forces in the cosmos. Stars and constellations were also revered, particularly the dark shapes seen within the Milky Way, which were interpreted as animals essential to Andean life: llamas, serpents, and condors. The heavens were a living tapestry, filled with signs that guided both agriculture and ritual. The natural landscape itself was imbued with sacredness. Mountains, or apus, were worshipped as powerful spirits, guardians of the land and sources of water. Each community had its own sacred peaks, to which offerings were made for protection and fertility, Rivers, springs and stones were huacas, sacred places where the divine intersected with the human world. In this sense, the entire landscape of the Andes was alive with spiritual presence. To travel through the empire was not just to cross geography, but to move through a sacred map dotted with countless sites of ritual significance. Rituals were the means by which this cosmic order was maintained. The Incas believed that reciprocity was essential. Just as humans depended on the gods for life and fertility, the gods depended on humans for offerings and devotion. Ceremonies involved sacrifices of food, textiles, animals, and in some cases humans. Llamas, especially white ones, were sacrificed to the sun, their blood offered as a life-giving force. Human sacrifice, though rare, was practiced in moments of great importance, such as the coronation of a ruler, the dedication of a temple, or the response to natural disasters. Children were often chosen for these sacrifices, not as punishment, but as honoured offerings, believed to carry purity that would please the gods. The remains of such sacrifices, preserved in the cold of the Andes, reveal the care with which they were prepared, dressed in fine textiles and adorned with precious ornaments. Festivals marked the calendar and reinforced the unity of the empire. The most important was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, held at the winter solstice in June. During this time, the Sapa Inca, priests, nobles and representatives from across the empire gathered in Cusco to honour Inti. Rituals included dances, processions, sacrifices and feasting. The festival reaffirmed the relationship between the sun, the ruler and the people, binding them together in a shared act of devotion. Other festivals marked planting and harvest seasons, solstices and equinoxes, and key moments in the agricultural cycle. Through these rituals, time itself was sacralized, and the empire's rhythms aligned with those of the cosmos. Priests played a crucial role in this system, interpreting signs, conducting ceremonies, and advising rulers. The high priest of the sun, often a close relative of the Sapa Inca, oversaw rituals at the Coricancha and ensured that the calendar of ceremonies was maintained. Local priests tended to regional huacas, maintaining the balance between imperial and local religion. Divination was an important practice, with priests interpreting the flight of birds, the patterns of coca leaves, or the behaviour of flames to discern the will of the gods. Decisions about war, expansion and governance often depended on such consultations, reflecting the integration of religion into every level of politics. The role of religion in legitimizing conquest was profound. When the Incas incorporated new peoples into the empire, they respected local gods and huacas, but always subordinated them to Inti and to Cusco's authority. Conquered communities were often required to send representatives to participate in rituals at the Coricancha, symbolically tying their local traditions to the imperial centre. Temples to the sun were established in new regions, and local deities were often brought to Cusco, where they were housed alongside the empire's gods. This process allowed the Incas to unify a diverse population under a common religious framework without erasing local identities. Religion also shaped the architecture of the empire. Temples were aligned with celestial events, plazas were designed for processions, and cities were laid out to reflect cosmic symbols. The sacred Seki system in Cusco radiated lines outward from the Coricancha, connecting the city to hundreds of huacas in the surrounding landscape. Each line was associated with specific rituals and responsibilities, creating a vast sacred geography that linked the centre of the empire to its periphery. To walk these lines was to participate in the maintenance of cosmic order, binding the people, the land and the gods into a single system. The Inca understanding of the cosmos was structured into three realms. Hananpacha, the upper world, was the domain of the sun, moon, stars and gods. Kpacha, the middle world, was the realm of humans, animals and daily life. Ukupacha, the inner or underworld, was associated with the ancestors, fertility and the cycles of death and rebirth. These realms were not separate but interconnected, with rituals ensuring the proper balance between them. Caves, springs, and other natural features often served as portals between realms, places where the living could communicate with gods and ancestors. Ancestor worship was another essential aspect of Inca religion. The mummified bodies of rulers and nobles were preserved and treated as living beings. They were dressed, fed, consulted, and paraded during festivals. Ancestors were seen as active participants in the life of the community, their presence ensuring continuity and legitimacy. The cult of the dead reinforced the dynastic nature of Inca rule, linking the living Sapa Inca to his predecessors and projecting his authority into the future. In this way, the past was never gone. It remained present in ritual, in mummies, and in the collective memory of the people. What made Inca religion distinctive was its fusion of practicality and spirituality. The rituals ensured agricultural fertility, the festivals reinforced political unity, and the temples embodied cosmic order. Religion was not an abstract philosophy, but a lived reality, embedded in the rhythms of work, the cycles of the seasons, and the structures of power. It gave meaning to conquest, legitimacy to rulers, and cohesion to a diverse empire. It made the Andes not just a geographical space, but a sacred landscape where every mountain, river, and stone spoke of divine presence. As the empire grew, religion became the glue that held it together. Roads carried not only armies and goods, but also pilgrims and offerings. Cities were built not only as administrative centres, but as sacred spaces. The Sapa Inca ruled not only as a king, but as a living son of the sun. In every aspect, religion permeated the empire, making it more than a political or economic system. It was a cosmic order, carefully maintained through ritual, architecture, and authority. This deep intertwining of religion and power leads naturally to the figure of the Sapa Inca himself, for he was not simply a political leader, but the embodiment of divine will. His court, his rituals, his appearance, and his very existence were framed in religious terms, making him the axis around which the empire revolved. To understand how the Incas ruled, one must now step into the royal court, where the Sapa Inca reigned as the son of the sun and the living centre of Tawantinsuyu. At the centre of Tawantinsuyu stood a single figure, the Sapa Inca, the unique one, the son of the sun, the living axis of the empire. His presence was not merely political, but divine, for he was understood as both ruler and god, the earthly representative of Inti, whose authority reached across mountains, valleys, deserts, and coasts. To speak of the Inca state is to speak of him, for all roads, rituals, and institutions ultimately pointed back to the throne in Cusco. Yet the Sapa Inca was never alone. He was surrounded by a court whose structure, ceremony, and hierarchy reflected and reinforced his position as the centre of the cosmos. To enter the royal court was to enter a world of power and sacred order, where every gesture and every object spoke of the divine authority embodied in a single man. The Sapa Inca was distinguished from his subjects in every aspect of life. He wore garments woven of the finest textiles, called kumbi, crafted by specialized women known as akala, or chosen women. These textiles were so highly prized that they were more valuable than gold or silver. Once the Sapa Inca had worn a garment, it was never worn again, for his clothing was considered sacred, infused with his divine essence. His head was adorned with the masque pacha, a crimson fringe that symbolized his unique status. No one else in the empire was permitted to wear this emblem. To see the Sapa Inca was to be reminded visually and materially of his difference from all other mortals. His physical presence was carefully managed. Ordinary people could not look directly at him, and those who approached his presence did so barefoot, carrying burdens to show humility. Even high nobles bowed before him, and his words were treated as law. Audiences with the Sapa Inca were occasions of ritual, not informal meetings. The throne was surrounded by attendants, priests, and advisors, each reinforcing the majesty of the figure who sat at the centre. In this way, His authority was not simply a matter of command, but a carefully staged performance of divine kingship. The royal court in Cusco was the stage on which this performance unfolded. At its centre stood the palaces of the ruling dynasty, each constructed during the reign of a Sapa Inca, and continuing to serve as the residence of his lineage after his death. These palaces were not merely homes, but centres of administration, ceremony and memory. Within their walls, officials recorded tribute on Quipus, priests prepared rituals, and nobles attended to matters of state. Each palace reflected the achievements and personality of its founder, adding to the living archive of Cusco's history. Together they created a city where stone and lineage intertwined, where each corner bore the mark of royal presence. The court itself was a complex hierarchy. At its highest level were the royal family and the principal wives of the Sapa Inca. Chief among them was the Koya, the queen, often a sister of the ruler, whose marriage preserved the purity of the divine line. The Koya held authority of her own, overseeing certain rituals and playing a role in succession. Other wives, drawn from noble families across the empire, served to cement alliances and bring influential groups into the royal orbit. The children of these unions, numbering in the dozens, formed the next generation of nobles and potential claimants to power. Beyond the immediate family were the Panakas, the royal lineages descended from past rulers. Each Panaka maintained the palace and mummy of its ancestor, preserving his memory through ritual and continuing to exercise influence in the affairs of state. The Panakas were not simply families but institutions, each representing a strand of dynastic continuity. They were both allies and rivals, supporting the throne while also competing for influence. The balance between the reigning ruler and the Panasas of past rulers was a delicate one, shaping the politics of succession and governance. The nobles of Cusco formed another layer of the court. Drawn from the leading aeolus of the city, they held positions as administrators, generals and priests. Their proximity to the Sapa Inca gave them prestige, but their service was also essential to the functioning of the state. The empire could not be governed by one man alone. It required a hierarchy of officials who could carry out orders across vast distances. These nobles formed the backbone of that system, trained in Cusco, tied to the royal family through marriage, and bound by loyalty to the throne. The court also included specialized attendants, artisans, and servants. The akalas, or chosen women, lived in seclusion, weaving fine textiles, brewing chicha, and preparing offerings for rituals. Some became wives or concubines of the ruler or high nobles, while others served in temples as priestesses. Artisans crafted ornaments of gold and silver, worked stone with precision, and produced objects that adorned palaces and temples. Servants carried out the daily tasks of maintaining the palaces, while guards ensured security and order. Together, these groups created a court that was both a centre of splendour and a machine of administration. The daily life of the Sapa Inca was governed by ritual. He rose in the morning to greet the sun, offering prayers and libations to Inti. Meals were taken with ceremony, often involving foods brought from across the empire to demonstrate its abundance. Audiences with nobles and foreign envoys were staged as formal events, with elaborate protocol emphasizing the ruler's majesty. Rituals punctuated the year, from the great festivals of Inti Raymi to smaller ceremonies tied to planting and harvest. The Sapa Inca was always visible as both king and priest, embodying the dual role of ruler and son of the sun. His decisions carried the weight of divine authority. To defy the Sapa Inca was to defy Inti himself, and obedience was expected as a sacred duty. Yet his rule was not based solely on fear or compulsion. The Sapa Inca was also the benefactor of his people, ensuring that roads were built, storehouses filled, and festivals held. The redistribution of resources through the state demonstrated his generosity, reinforcing the principle of reciprocity that underpinned Inca society. In return for their labour and tribute, the people received security, order, and sustenance. This balance of obligation and reward made the empire stable, at least while the system functioned as intended. The court was also the place where diplomacy was conducted. Envoys from conquered regions came to Cusco to present tribute, offer loyalty, and participate in rituals. They were received with ceremony, their presence affirming the empire's unity. Marriage alliances were arranged at court, linking distant regions to the royal family. Foreign leaders were honoured and incorporated into the imperial system, often given noble titles and roles in administration. The court thus served as both a domestic and international stage, projecting Inca power not only across the Andes but into the minds of all who entered its orbit. Succession was one of the most delicate issues managed within the court. The Sapa Inca had many sons, but there was no fixed rule of primogeniture. Instead, the heir was often chosen from among the most capable, sometimes after struggles and disputes. The Coya's son had a strong claim, but other wives' sons might also contend. This uncertainty created tension, but also ensured that the heir was often a proven leader, capable of carrying on the work of expansion and governance. The court was therefore not only a place of ceremony, but also of intrigue, where alliances and rivalries shaped the future of the empire. Even in death, the Sapa Inca remained part of the court. His body was preserved as a mummy, dressed in fine garments, seated in his palace, and treated as if still alive. Offerings of food and drink were made to him, and his voice was consulted through priests who interpreted his will. During festivals, the mummies of past rulers were brought out, paraded through the plazas, and honoured alongside the living ruler. In this way, the court was never limited to the present. It included the past as an active participant. The dead and the living together formed the community of power, reinforcing continuity across generations. The wealth of the court was immense. Gold and silver adorned palaces and temples, textiles of the finest quality clothed nobles and priests, and food and drink flowed in abundance during festivals. Yet wealth was not hoarded privately, but used to display the majesty of the empire. The splendour of the court was itself a political tool, impressing both subjects and visitors with the might of the Inca state. To walk through the plazas of Cusco, to see the golden walls of the Coricancha, to participate in the festivals of the sun was to be immersed in a vision of order, prosperity, and divine favour. The image of the Sapa Inca and his court was carried outward through the empire. Local rulers modelled their courts on Cusco, adopting similar rituals, clothing, and architecture. The presence of the Sapa Inca was evoked in provincial ceremonies, reinforcing his authority even at great distances. The court in Cusco thus became a model for the empire as a whole, a template of divine kingship reproduced in miniature across Tawantinsuyu. In the end, the Sapa Inca and his court embodied the essence of the empire. They represented the fusion of politics, religion, and society into a single system centered on a divine ruler. The court was a place of splendor and intrigue, of ritual and administration, of past and present united in stone and ceremony. To understand the empire is to understand the court, for it was here that the vision of Tawantinsuyu was staged, enacted, and sustained. The majesty of the court, however, was not sustained by splendor alone. It depended on the productivity of the land, the abundance of crops, and the ingenuity of agriculture. Without terraces carved into mountains, without canals channeling water, without storehouses filled with maize and potatoes, the empire could not endure. From the rituals of the court, the story turns naturally to the fields and terraces, to the miracle of agriculture that fed millions and made the vision of the Sapa Inca a reality across the Andes. The majesty of the Sapa Inca and the brilliance of his court depended on more than ritual gold and ceremony. The foundation of the empire's greatness was the productivity of the land and the ingenuity with which the Incas managed their environment. In a region where geography seemed designed to frustrate human survival, they built an agricultural system of remarkable sophistication. They tamed mountainsides with terraces, channeled water through canals, experimented with seeds at different altitudes, and created storage systems that ensured stability even in lean years. Agriculture was not only the means of feeding millions, but also a sacred act, a partnership between humanity, the gods, and the land itself. The Andes presented challenges unlike those faced by most civilizations. Instead of broad river valleys with predictable flooding, the Incas inherited a landscape of steep slopes, thin soils, and climates that could shift dramatically within a few kilometers. In one valley, maize could flourish, while a few hundred meters higher only potatoes could survive, and still higher the land was suitable only for pastures where llamas and alpacas grazed. To thrive here required not only resilience but also creativity. The Incas perfected a system that took advantage of these vertical ecological zones, creating what scholars have called the vertical archipelago. Communities spread across different altitudes, each cultivating what grew best in its zone and exchanging products to ensure a balanced diet. Terracing was the most visible and transformative of their techniques. By cutting steps into mountainsides, they created flat plots of land that retained soil and water, prevented erosion, and allowed cultivation at altitudes that would otherwise have been barren. Stone-retaining walls supported these terraces, some of which rose in series from valley floors to high ridges, creating the appearance of vast staircases ascending the mountains. The terraces not only provided fertile soil, but also created microclimates, with lower terraces warmer and upper terraces cooler, allowing for the cultivation of diverse crops in close proximity. Water management was equally ingenious. The Incas built canals, aqueducts and reservoirs to capture and distribute water. Springs were tapped and diverted, rainfall was conserved, and runoff was controlled to prevent floods. In some regions, they constructed sophisticated drainage systems that carried excess water away while maintaining soil fertility. Water was not simply a resource but a sacred gift, and its management was both a technical and religious act. Rituals accompanied the opening of canals and the planting of fields, ensuring that the gods were honoured as partners in the work of agriculture. The variety of crops cultivated was extraordinary. Potatoes, in hundreds of varieties, formed the staple of the highlands, adapted to different soils, altitudes and climates. Maize, though more difficult to grow at high altitudes, was cultivated in the lower valleys and became a symbol of prestige, often used in festivals and brewed into chicha, the ritual beer of the Andes. Quinoa, amaranth, beans, peppers and squash added diversity to the diet. Fruits grew in the coastal and lowland regions, while coca leaves, cultivated in warmer valleys, were treasured for their stimulant properties and sacred significance. The Incas not only grew these crops, but also developed methods of preservation, such as freeze-drying potatoes into suño, which could be stored for years and transported across the empire. Storage was a key element of the agricultural system. Colcas, the storehouses built across the empire, held surplus crops, dried meat, textiles and other goods. These storehouses were strategically placed along roads, near settlements, and at high altitudes where the cool air helped preserve food. Ventilation systems allowed air to circulate, preventing spoilage. Through this network, the state could redistribute food in times of famine, supply armies on campaign, and provide for large gatherings during festivals. The existence of surplus not only stabilized the empire, but also demonstrated the generosity of the Sapa Inca, who appeared as the provider of abundance for his people. Agriculture was inseparable from religion. Planting and harvest were marked by ceremonies, offerings and prayers to Inti, Mamaquila, Pachamama, and the Apus. Farmers made libations of chicha before sowing seeds, asking the gods for fertility. Llamas were sacrificed at key moments, their blood offered to ensure the growth of crops. Each community honoured its local huacas, but all were tied to the larger framework of the empire's religious calendar. Agriculture was not just labour, it was participation in the cosmic order, maintaining the balance between humans, gods and the natural world. One of the most remarkable examples of Inca agricultural ingenuity was the site of Moray, near Cusco. Here, the Incas constructed a series of circular terraces descending into the earth like a giant amphitheatre. Each level created a distinct microclimate, with temperature differences of several degrees between the top and bottom. It is believed that Moray functioned as an agricultural laboratory, where the Incas experimented with different crops and conditions, testing seeds to determine where they grew best. This innovation allowed them to maximize productivity and adapt crops to diverse environments. It demonstrates not only their practical skill, but also their scientific curiosity, a recognition that agriculture required constant experimentation and adaptation. The integration of herding into the agricultural system added another dimension. Llamas and alpacas provided meat, wool, and transport, while their dung fertilized fields. Herds were managed carefully, with some owned by the state, others by temples, and others by communities. The movement of herds across altitudes mirrored the vertical exchange of crops, ensuring that resources were distributed efficiently. The relationship between humans and animals was also spiritual, with rituals honouring the herds and seeking their fertility. In this way, livestock was both an economic and a religious asset, woven into the larger fabric of Inca society. The scale of Inca agriculture supported the empire's population, estimated in the millions. Without intensive farming, the great cities, armies, and ceremonies would have been impossible. The system also allowed the Incas to project power into distant regions, for the surplus stored in kolkas provided security during campaigns and famine. In comparison to other civilizations, the Incas achieved an extraordinary level of stability, not through trade or markets in the modern sense, but through centralized management of resources. The empire was, in a sense, a vast agricultural machine designed to feed, sustain, and organize its people. The impact of this system extended beyond the material. Agriculture reinforced the principle of reciprocity that underpinned Inca society. Communities provided labour for terraces, canals, and fields, but in return they received food, security, and participation in festivals. The Sapa Inca appeared not only as a ruler but as a provider, ensuring abundance through his relationship with the gods. The terraces, canals, and storehouses were visible symbols of this reciprocity, reminding the people that their labour was returned to them in the form of sustenance and order. The miracle of terracing and agriculture also shaped the landscape itself. To travel through the empire was to see mountainsides transformed into staircases of green, rivers harnessed into canals, and valleys filled with crops. The Andes became a humanized landscape, not stripped of its sacredness but enhanced by human labour. The Incas saw themselves not as conquerors of nature, but as partners with it, shaping the land to their needs while honouring its spirits. This integration of environment, economy and religion was one of the hallmarks of their civilization. Even today, the terraces built by the Incas continue to be used in some regions, their walls still holding soil and water centuries after the fall of the empire. They stand as testimony to a system that was both resilient and sustainable, adapted to the harsh realities of the Andes. Modern agriculture, with all its technology, often struggles to match the ingenuity of these ancient techniques. The Incas demonstrated that survival in a difficult environment required not only labour but vision, the ability to see the land not as an obstacle but as a partner in creation. From the terraces and fields, the story of the Incas moves naturally into the heavens, for agriculture was inseparable from time, and time was measured by the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The Inca calendar, their astronomical observations, and their rituals of sacred time guided the planting and harvest, aligned ceremonies with the cosmos, and reinforced the vision of the universe ordered by divine will. To understand how the Incas farmed is also to understand how they read the sky, for the two are one and the same in the rhythm of life in Tawantinsuyu. The Inca world was built not only upon terraces and canals, but also upon time itself. Agriculture, ritual, politics, and society all depended on a careful reading of the heavens, the measurement of seasons, and the organization of ceremonies according to sacred cycles. For the Incas, time was not an abstract concept measured by clocks or written calendars, but a living rhythm woven into the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. To understand their empire is to understand how they ordered this rhythm, how they aligned their lives with cosmic forces, and how they believed that by doing so they sustained harmony in the universe. The sun, Inti, was the most visible marker of time. Its daily rising and setting structured life, while its annual path across the sky marked the seasons. The solstices and equinoxes were of particular importance, for they indicated turning points in the year when rituals were performed to ensure agricultural fertility and cosmic balance. The great festival of Inti Raymi, held at the winter solstice in June, celebrated the rebirth of the sun when its rays began to strengthen again. Offerings were made, sacrifices performed, and ceremonies conducted to ensure that Inti would continue to bless the land with warmth and light. The summer solstice, equinoxes, and other solar markers were also celebrated with rituals that aligned human activity with celestial order. The moon, Mamakila, played a complementary role. Her phases structured the months, guiding the timing of planting, harvest, and ritual. The Incas recognized 12 lunar months, each associated with specific festivals and agricultural tasks. A 13th, shorter month was sometimes added to align lunar and solar cycles. Mamaquila's temple in Cusco stood alongside that of Inti, reflecting her importance in regulating time and fertility. Her cycles were particularly tied to women, childbirth, and family life, embedding the rhythms of the moon into the fabric of society. The Milky Way, or Mayu in Quechua, was another central feature of Inca astronomy. Seen as a celestial river, it mirrored the rivers on Earth, particularly the Vilcanota, which flowed near Cusco. The Incas observed not only the bright stars, but also the dark patches within the Milky Way, interpreting them as constellations of animals, a llama, a serpent, a toad, and others essential to Andean life. These dark constellations were believed to influence the fertility of their earthly counterparts. The appearance and disappearance of certain stars and constellations guided agricultural tasks, signalling when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for seasonal changes. Observation of the heavens was not left to chance, but carefully organized. Cusco itself functioned as a great astronomical center, with sightlines and markers aligned to celestial events. The Sex system, a network of sacred lines radiating from the Coricancha, connected the city to hundreds of huacas in the surrounding landscape. Many of these huacas were aligned with the rising or setting of the sun at solstices and equinoxes, turning the landscape into a vast calendar. Priests and astronomers observed the movements of the heavens from these points, ensuring that rituals and agriculture remained in harmony with cosmic cycles. Special observatories reinforced this system. At Machu Picchu, the Intihuatana stone, or hitching post of the sun, served as a ritual and astronomical marker. Its carved surfaces aligned with the sun at key times of the year, symbolically tying the sun to the earth. At other sites, windows and corridors were oriented so that the sun's rays would pass through them precisely at solstices, casting light onto altars or sacred spaces. These alignments demonstrated the Incas' deep understanding of astronomy, achieved without telescopes or written charts, but through generations of careful observation and oral transmission. Time was not simply measured, it was sacralized. Each festival, each ceremony, each agricultural task was part of a larger cycle that repeated annually. The Incas believed that by performing rituals at the correct times, they sustained the balance of the cosmos. Failure to do so risked disorder, famine, or disaster. The calendar was therefore both a practical tool and a sacred responsibility. Priests ensured that rituals were performed on schedule, interpreting celestial signs and announcing the proper times for ceremonies. The entire empire participated in these cycles, creating unity through shared observance of sacred time. The Inca understanding of time extended beyond the yearly cycle to embrace larger concepts of cosmic order. They believed in alternating ages, cycles of creation and destruction overseen by Viracocha. The present age was not the first, but one in a sequence, and it too would eventually end to be replaced by another. This cyclical vision gave depth to their rituals, for they were not only maintaining the present, but also participating in the eternal renewal of the cosmos. The name Pachacuti, taken by the great emperor, reflected this idea: a world turning, a transformation of time itself. Sacred time was also tied to the lives of individuals and communities. Births, marriages, and deaths were marked by rituals that aligned personal transitions with cosmic rhythms. Children were named in ceremonies tied to the lunar cycle, marriages were blessed with offerings to the sun and the earth, and deaths were accompanied by rituals that ensured the soul's passage into the realm of ancestors. Communities observed local festivals tied to their huacas, but these were integrated into the larger imperial calendar, creating a hierarchy of sacred time that mirrored the political structure of the empire. The measurement of time was not done with written calendars, but with a combination of oral tradition, observation, and quipus. Some quipus may have recorded calendrical information, using knots and colours to track cycles of days, months, and years. Priests trained in astronomy passed down knowledge through generations, ensuring continuity despite the lack of written texts. The accuracy of their system is evident in the alignment of temples, terraces, and observatories, which demonstrate a precise understanding of solar and lunar movements. The relationship between time and power was profound. By controlling the calendar, the Inca state controlled the rhythms of society. Festivals gathered people together, reinforcing loyalty and obedience. Rituals tied to planting and harvest reminded communities of their dependence on both the gods and the state. The Sapa Inca appeared at key moments, embodying the connection between cosmic order and earthly rule. Time itself became a tool of governance, binding millions of people into a shared cycle of ritual and labour. The sacredness of time extended even into warfare and conquest. Campaigns were often launched at auspicious times, guided by divination and celestial observation. Victories were celebrated with rituals aligned to cosmic events, framing expansion as part of the divine plan. Even the administration of labour through the emitter system was tied to the calendar, with rotations of service scheduled according to seasonal cycles. Time was the thread that wove together every aspect of the empire, from the smallest community to the largest campaign. The Inca calendar and astronomy remind us that the empire was not sustained by force alone. It was sustained by belief, by the conviction that human life was part of a larger cosmic order that could be known, honoured, and maintained. The terraces, canals, and storehouses of the empire were built not only with stone and labour, but also with time, carefully measured and ritually sanctified. The sky above and the earth below were mirrors of one another, each reflecting the other in a cycle of reciprocity. From the heavens and the sacred calendar, the story of the Incas turns again to the lives of the people who sustained the empire through their labour. Time was measured not only in festivals and rituals, but also in cycles of work, the mitter system that organised the economy and bound communities to the state. To understand how the empire functioned on a daily basis, one must look at this system of labour and reciprocity, the engine that powered both the splendour of the court and the abundance of the terraces. The vast Inca Empire, stretching thousands of kilometres across mountains, valleys, coasts and deserts, could not have been sustained by armies alone. It required a system that organised millions of people, ensured the flow of food and goods, built and maintained roads, and supported monumental projects in city after city. That system was the mita, a carefully structured form of labour service that became the backbone of the economy and the key to the functioning of Tawantinsuyu. Unlike taxation in the form of coin or money, the Inca system extracted time, energy and skill from its subjects, weaving their lives into the larger rhythm of the state. The mita was not simply an economic arrangement, but a reflection of the Inca world view, a form of reciprocity extended to the scale of empire. At its core, the mita was based on the Andean principle of aini, or reciprocity. In village life, families helped one another with planting, harvesting, building, and herding. Labour was exchanged rather than bought, and cooperation ensured survival in the harsh environment of the Andes. The Incas took this principle and scaled it up to encompass an empire. Every Alu or kin-based community was required to provide a portion of its members to serve the state for a set period of time. In return, the state provided security, infrastructure, and food from its storehouses. This arrangement was understood not as exploitation, but as a mutual obligation. Though the balance of power meant that the state defined the terms, the range of tasks performed under the Aita was vast. Men were sent to build terraces, canals, roads, and bridges. They worked in quarries, cutting and transporting massive stones for temples and fortresses. They laboured in mines, extracting gold, silver, and copper that adorned temples and palaces. Others served in the army, marching across the empire to defend borders or expand territory. Women contributed through weaving, brewing chicha, and preparing offerings, often within the confines of the Akalahuasi, or houses of chosen women. Every skill, every talent, every able body could be mobilized through the mita system, turning the entire population into a workforce for the state. Agriculture was one of the primary beneficiaries of the mita. Fields were divided into 3 parts, one for the state, one for the temples, and one for the local community. The labour of the people cultivated all 3, ensuring that the state and religion were supplied alongside the villages themselves. The harvest from state and temple lands was stored in kolkas, the vast storehouses that dotted the empire. These surpluses were redistributed in times of famine, used to feed armies, and consumed during great festivals. The system ensured that the state could call upon resources whenever needed, while communities were protected against hunger and disaster. The construction of infrastructure depended heavily on the mita. The Kapak Nyan, the Great Road System, was built and maintained by rotating groups of workers drawn from across the empire. Bridges were rebuilt regularly, canals cleared, and terraces repaired. Fortresses like Sacsayhuaman, temples like the Coricancha, and cities like Machu Picchu all rose through the coordinated labour of thousands of mita workers. The ability to mobilise such large groups without wages or money demonstrates the extraordinary organisational capacity of the Inca state. Labour, rather than wealth in coin, was the true currency of the empire. The army also drew its strength from the mita. When campaigns were launched, each community sent men to serve for a period, returning after their duty was done. This rotation allowed the empire to field massive armies without maintaining a permanent standing force. Soldiers were supplied by the state through the network of storehouses, ensuring that even distant campaigns could be sustained. Victories brought new territories into the empire, whose populations were then incorporated into the mita system, expanding its reach. Conquest thus fed the system that made conquest possible, creating a cycle of expansion and integration. Mining was another sphere where the mita played a central role. Workers were sent to extract precious metals, particularly gold and silver, which were considered sacred and used in religious and ceremonial contexts. These metals adorned temples, palaces, and ritual objects, reinforcing the divine aura of the Sapa Inca and the gods. Though the labour was difficult and dangerous, it was framed within the broader system of reciprocity, where workers served for a time before returning to their communities. The extraction of metals was not for private profit, but for the glory of the state and the gods, reflecting the collective orientation of the Inca economy. The mita extended even into specialised crafts. Artisans and skilled workers were relocated through the mitmak system to places where their talents were needed. Potters, weavers, builders, and musicians all contributed to the life of the empire, often producing goods for state use or for the adornment of temples and festivals. Their labour, like that of farmers and soldiers, was part of the collective obligation to the state. By redistributing skilled workers, the Incas ensured that every region had access to the expertise needed for development and cohesion. What distinguished the Mita from forced labour in other empires was the principle of reciprocity. The state did not simply take, it also gave. The storehouses provided food in times of need, roads made travel easier, and festivals distributed goods and created opportunity for feasting. When disasters struck, droughts, floods, or crop failures, the state intervened, redistributing supplies to affected regions. This reciprocal relationship legitimized the system, making it appear as a partnership rather than sheer exploitation. The people labored for the state, but the state in turn sustained the people. Religion gave sacred weight to the Mita. Labor was not just work, but an offering to the gods. Building a terrace, carving a stone, or marching in an army was framed as service to Inti, to Pachamama, and to the cosmic order. Rituals accompanied major projects, with sacrifices made to ensure divine favour. The Sapa Inca, as the son of the sun, was seen as the channel through which this labour was sanctified. To work for him was to work for the gods, making the Mita not merely an economic system but a religious duty. The system was not without hardship. For families, the absence of men serving in distant projects could strain local labour needs. Some tasks, such as mining or long military campaigns, were gruelling and dangerous. Yet the structure of rotation meant that no individual was permanently burdened, and the benefits of the system, security, stability, and sustenance were real. In the balance of obligation and reciprocity, the Mita was accepted as the natural order of things, the way by which society and cosmos were held together. The Spanish conquest would later transform the Mita into something far harsher, a system of forced labour in mines that stripped away reciprocity and imposed devastating burdens. But in its Inca form, the Mita functioned as a dynamic and adaptive system that allowed an empire without money, markets, or wheels to flourish. It was the invisible mechanism behind the visible grandeur of roads, temples, terraces, and festivals, the engine that powered the state. The economy of Tawantinsuyu, based on the Mita, was unique in the ancient world. It was not a market economy, but a command economy rooted in reciprocity and redistribution. Land and labour were organised collectively, surpluses stored and redistributed, and resources managed by the state for the benefit of both gods and people. The absence of money did not mean the absence of wealth. Rather, wealth was measured in the ability to mobilise and sustain labour. The Inca Empire was, in this sense, an empire of people rather than of coin. The Mita also shaped society itself. Communities were bound together not only by kinship, but by shared service to the state. Participation in labour created a sense of belonging to the larger whole, while the benefits of the system reinforced loyalty. The visibility of the results, roads, terraces, storehouses and festivals, made the reciprocity tangible. To walk on a road, to eat from a storehouse, to dance in a festival was to experience directly the return of one's labour. The system created not only an economy, but a culture of shared obligation and shared reward. From the fields and roads built by the Mita, the story of the Incas turns naturally to the products of that labour, which went beyond survival, the art, textiles, and objects of beauty that adorned their world. The economy provided abundance, but the Incas did not see wealth solely in practical terms. They invested labour and skill into creating beauty, into weaving, carving, and shaping the materials of their land into symbols of identity, power, and devotion. The Mita sustained the body of the empire, but art revealed its soul. The empire of the Incas was sustained by labour, agriculture, and ritual, but it was also expressed in forms of beauty that carried meaning beyond mere decoration. For the Incas, art was not a pursuit separated from daily life, or confined to a class of specialists working for private patrons. It was part of the fabric of existence, woven into clothing, carved into stone, cast into metal, and sung or danced in festivals. Beauty was never empty. It carried spiritual, social, and political significance. Textiles, ceramics, jewellery, and architecture were not only admired for their craftsmanship, but also recognised as symbols of power, offerings to the gods, and markers of identity. To enter the world of Inca art is to enter a world where every object carried meaning, where beauty was a form of order, and where aesthetics were inseparable from life itself. Among all forms of Inca artistry, textiles held the highest prestige. More valuable than gold or silver, textiles were the currency of status in the language of communication. Woven on backstrap and upright looms by women and specialised weavers known as a siela, or chosen women, textiles displayed patterns and colours that conveyed information about the wearer's rank, region and role. The most prized fabrics were made from vicuña wool, incredibly fine and soft, gathered from animals that were driven into kraals in great hunts. Garments woven from this wool were reserved for the nobility and the Sapa Inca himself. Once worn, they were considered sacred and never used again. The designs woven into textiles were not arbitrary but symbolic. Geometric patterns such as stepped motifs, checkerboards, and zigzags reflected concepts of duality, balance, and cosmic order. Checkerboard tunics, for example, were often associated with soldiers and military rank, while other patterns marked ethnic groups or administrative roles. Colours carried their own meanings, with red often symbolising conquest and authority, black representing creation and death, and yellow reflecting maize and gold. Textiles functioned as visible signs of identity and status, but they also carried sacred significance, used as offerings in rituals and buried with the dead as gifts for the afterlife. Ceramics were another medium through which the Incas expressed beauty and meaning. Though less elaborate than those of earlier Andean cultures like the moche, Inca pottery reflected a preference for standardized forms and practical uses. Vessels known as arribalos, with pointed bases and flaring necks, were used to store and pour chicha, the maize beer central to festivals and rituals. The shape was both functional, allowing the vessels to be carried on the back and set securely in the ground, and symbolic, representing abundance and continuity. Designs on ceramics often echoed the geometric motifs found in textiles, reinforcing a shared visual language across media. Metalwork also flourished, particularly in gold, silver and copper. The Incas did not value metals as currency, but as sacred materials associated with the gods. Gold was the sweat of the sun, silver the tears of the moon, and copper the blood of the earth. These associations gave metal spiritual power. Artisans hammered sheets of gold and silver into ornaments, ritual objects, and decorations for temples. The coricancha, lined with golden panels and filled with life-sized figures of plants and animals crafted from precious metals, was the most dazzling example of this artistry. Metal objects were not mere displays of wealth, but offerings to the gods, embodiments of divine presence, and affirmations of the Sapa Inca's connection to the cosmos. Stone, however, was the medium in which the Incas expressed their greatest artistic genius. Their architecture was not only functional, but profoundly aesthetic, achieving beauty through precision, harmony, and integration with the landscape. The walls of Cusco, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu demonstrate a mastery of stone cutting and fitting that remains astonishing. Massive blocks, some weighing dozens of tons, were shaped and fitted together so perfectly that no mortar was needed. The joints were seamless, the angles precise, and the lines flowing. The aesthetic impact came not from ornamentation, but from the sheer perfection of form, the way the stone seemed to grow naturally from the earth. Inca stonework was both engineering and art, practical and spiritual, a demonstration of power and an offering to the gods of the mountains. Music and dance also played vital roles in Inca artistic expression. Instruments such as flutes, panpipes, drums, and conch shells created sounds that accompanied rituals, festivals, and daily life. Music was believed to carry spiritual power, connecting humans with the gods and influencing the natural world. Dances performed in plazas and fields embodied themes of fertility, warfare, and cosmic balance, with participants wearing costumes that represented animals, ancestors, or deities. The rhythm of the drums, the sound of flutes, and the movements of dancers turned festivals into living works of art, uniting communities in shared expression. The integration of art into daily life was profound. Clothing marked social status, pottery served ritual feasts, metal objects adorned temples, and architecture shaped the very environment. Art was not produced for galleries or private display, but for use, for ritual, for affirmation of order. Every object, no matter how practical, was an opportunity for beauty and meaning. A spindle whorl carved with patterns, a gourd decorated with designs, or a tool shaped with care reflected the belief that beauty was part of the proper order of things. The Inca sense of beauty was rooted in harmony, duality, and reciprocity. Just as their society balanced state and community, labour and reward, human effort and divine favour, so their art reflected balance between form and function, colour and pattern, natural material and human skill. Beauty was achieved not by excess, but by precision, by fitting things together in ways that reflected the larger order of the cosmos. A wall of stone, a tunic of woven wool, a vessel of clay. All were beautiful when they expressed harmony with their purpose and with the world around them. Art also played a role in conquest and integration. Conquered peoples were required to send artisans to Cusco, where their skills were incorporated into the imperial system. Local styles and motifs were preserved but standardized, creating a shared visual language across the empire. Textiles, ceramics, and architecture thus became tools of unification, reinforcing the identity of Tawantinsuyu while allowing local traditions to survive within its framework. The empire's diversity was expressed in its art, but always under the overarching order defined by the Incas. In funerary contexts, art expressed beliefs about the afterlife. Mummies were dressed in fine textiles, adorned with ornaments, and surrounded by offerings of ceramics, food, and tools. These objects were not symbolic alone. They were believed to accompany the dead into the next world, providing sustenance and status. Beauty was not confined to the present, but extended into eternity, ensuring that order and abundance continued beyond death. When the Spanish arrived, they were struck by the abundance of gold, silver, and textiles, but they often failed to grasp the meaning behind them. To the Incas, these objects were not mere wealth, but sacred embodiments of cosmic forces. The Spaniards melted down golden figures, stripped temples of their panels, and took textiles as loot, unaware that they were dismantling a world of meaning as much as a treasury of riches. The destruction of these objects was not only material but spiritual, an attack on the very order of Inca life. Even so, much survived in hidden places, in the continuity of traditions and in the persistence of techniques. Andean weavers still produce textiles that echo Inca designs, potters still shape vessels with ancient forms, and dancers still perform rituals tied to cycles of planting and harvest. The Inca sense of beauty, though disrupted, did not vanish. It remains embedded in the Andes, where the integration of form, function and meaning continues to guide artistic expression. From the world of art and beauty, the story of the Incas turns to the world of war, where aesthetics and meaning took on yet another dimension. The checkerboard tunics of soldiers, the ornamented weapons, the rituals performed before battle, all reflected the same integration of practicality and symbolism. Just as terraces fed the empire and textiles clothed it, warfare expanded its boundaries and sustained its power. To understand the Incas fully, one must see how they waged war, how they planned campaigns, and how they used conquest not only to dominate but to integrate, making the expansion of Tawantinsuyu another form of artistry, one painted not with dyes or stone but with strategy, courage, and discipline. The Inca Empire, vast and unified under a single vision, didn't emerge through peaceful negotiation alone. Behind the splendour of Cusco, the terraces of the valleys, and the rituals of the sun, there was also the discipline of armies, the logic of strategy, and the determination to expand. Warfare was one of the engines that drove Tawantinsuyu forward, enabling the Incas to incorporate diverse peoples into their system, secure fertile lands and vital resources, and project their authority across the Andes. War for the Incas was never random violence. It was structured, ritualized, and tied to the cosmic order. Like agriculture and art, it was a sacred duty, framed as a partnership with the gods. To understand how the empire grew, one must enter the world of Inca war and see how strategy, organization, and ideology combined to create one of the most extraordinary expansions in pre-Columbian history. The army was not a permanent standing force, but a mobilized extension of the Mita system. Every able-bodied man owed military service to the state, called up when needed for campaigns, and then returned to his community. This rotation allowed the Incas to summon vast armies, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, without draining any one region permanently. The army was therefore a true expression of the empire's organization, a collective force raised through shared obligation. Commanders were drawn from the nobility, often close relatives of the Sapa Inca, ensuring loyalty and maintaining dynastic control over the most critical instrument of power. Preparation for war involved ritual as much as logistics. Before a campaign, priests performed divination to determine the will of the gods, interpreting signs in the flight of birds, the patterns of coca leaves, or the entrails of sacrificed animals. Sacrifices were offered to Inti and to the Apos, the mountain spirits, seeking their blessing for the journey ahead. Soldiers marched not only with weapons, but with the conviction that their cause was sanctified. Victories were attributed to divine favour as much as to human strength, reinforcing the connection between warfare and cosmic order. The equipment of Inca soldiers reflected both practicality and symbolism. They carried slings capable of hurling stones with deadly force, spears tipped with bronze or obsidian, clubs with heavy stone or metal heads, and bolas used to entangle enemies. Shields made of wood or hide provided protection, while padded cotton armour absorbed blows. Helmets crafted from wood, cane or metal were sometimes adorned with feathers, giving soldiers a distinctive and imposing appearance. Tunics decorated with checkerboard patterns identified warriors, with different designs marking rank or origin. Weapons and clothing were not merely tools of battle, but visual affirmations of unity and identity, making the army a moving tapestry of order. The organisation of campaigns was meticulous. Scouts were sent ahead to gather intelligence about terrain, enemy numbers and possible alliances. Supply lines were carefully planned, relying on the network of roads and storehouses that provided food, weapons and clothing. As the army moved, it was fed from kolkas strategically placed along the route, ensuring that soldiers did not depend on plunder or strain local communities excessively. The logistical capacity of the Inca state meant that campaigns could extend across deserts, mountains and jungles, sustaining large forces in environments that would have overwhelmed less organised societies. When facing new peoples, the Incas often employed a policy of offering submission before battle. Envoys were sent to demand loyalty to the Sapa Inca, promising protection, incorporation of local gods into the Inca pantheon, and access to the benefits of the empire. Many communities, recognizing the overwhelming power of the Inca system, chose to accept, preserving their leaders and traditions under imperial rule. Those who resisted faced the full force of the army, and defeat could bring harsh consequences. The execution of leaders, the relocation of populations through the Mitmac system, and the integration of survivors into the empire on terms set by Cusco. Conquest was thus both diplomatic and military, relying on persuasion as much as on force. Battles themselves were often fierce, with armies clashing on highland plains or within narrow valleys. Sling stones could shatter skulls at long distances, while hand-to-hand combat with clubs and spears determined outcomes at close quarters. The noise of drums, horns and conch shells added to the chaos, while banners and ornaments marked units and inspired courage. Yet even in battle, ritual played a role. Priests accompanied armies, carrying sacred objects and performing ceremonies to ensure divine favour. Victory was celebrated with offerings to the gods, while defeats were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, requiring renewed devotion. The expansion of the empire under Pachacuti and his successors demonstrates the effectiveness of this system. From Cusco, armies marched north into present-day Ecuador, encountering societies that resisted fiercely but were eventually subdued. To the south, they pushed into the Altiplano around Lake Titicaca, conquering the Colla and other powerful groups. To the west, they reached the coast, incorporating fertile valleys and tapping into trade networks that brought exotic goods into the empire. To the east, they advanced into the edges of the Amazon, though the dense forests limited expansion in that direction. Within a few generations, the empire stretched for more than 4,000 kilometres, rivaling the scale of Rome or China. The Micmac policy of resettlement was closely tied to conquest. Defeated peoples were often relocated to distant regions, breaking their ability to rebel while also spreading their skills throughout the empire. At the same time, loyal populations were settled in newly conquered areas, establishing Inca authority and creating a patchwork of diversity bound together by shared obligations. This strategy ensured that conquest was not temporary, but consolidated, transforming victories on the battlefield into long-term stability. Warfare was also a means of spreading ideology. Conquered peoples were introduced to the cult of Inti, required to send representatives to Cusco for festivals, and integrated into the empire's calendar of rituals. Local gods were respected but subordinated, housed in temples alongside Inca deities. The presence of the Sapa Inca's envoys, the participation in imperial festivals, and the construction of sun temples turned conquest into cultural integration. War thus created not only political subjugation, but also spiritual inclusion, binding diverse peoples into the cosmic order proclaimed by Cusco. The discipline of the army reflected the discipline of the state. Soldiers were expected to obey orders without question, to maintain formation, and to endure hardship. The system of rotation meant that armies were constantly refreshed, with new groups of men replacing those who had completed their service. Training emphasized endurance, coordination, and loyalty, qualities that mirrored the values of the empire itself. Victory was not achieved through individual heroism, but through collective strength, just as the empire was not sustained by individuals alone, but by the organized effort of millions. The legacy of Inca warfare can be seen in the way the empire's borders were defined. Unlike some empires that sought to dominate through destruction or terror, the Incas sought to incorporate and integrate. Conquest was followed by construction. Roads, terraces, temples, and administrative centres appeared in newly subdued regions, transforming them into functioning parts of Tawantinsuyu. The army opened the way, but it was the infrastructure of the state that held the territory. This pattern of war followed by integration ensured that expansion did not overextend the empire, but instead reinforced its unity. Even in their approach to resistance, the Incas revealed their pragmatism. Rebellions were met with swift suppression, but survivors were often reintegrated rather than annihilated. The empire could be harsh, but it was rarely wantonly destructive. Its goal was order, not chaos, incorporation, not eradication. This pragmatic approach allowed it to endure despite its vast size and diversity. The memory of conquest was always present, but it was softened by the visible benefits of incorporation: roads, festivals, food security, and protection. The role of warfare in Inca society was thus both practical and symbolic. It provided resources, secured territories, and expanded the empire, but it also reinforced the cosmic order. Victories affirmed the favour of the gods, the authority of the Sapa Inca, and the inevitability of Tawantinsuyu's expansion. Battles were not merely clashes of arms, but rituals of order against disorder, civilization against chaos. In victory, the Incas saw proof that their empire was the embodiment of divine will. From the clash of armies and the discipline of campaigns, the story of the Incas turns to the quieter rhythms of daily life. For while conquest and expansion defined the empire's external face, its internal strength came from the routines, traditions, and labours of ordinary people. To see the Inca world fully, one must step into the villages and homes, into the fields and markets, and into the cycles of work and ritual that shaped the lives of the millions who made up Tawantinsuyu. Behind the golden temples of Cusco, the vast road system stretching across the Andes, and the glory of Inca armies marching in checkerboard tunics, there was the daily rhythm of life carried out by millions of ordinary men, women, and children. The empire of Tawantinsuyu was not sustained only by rulers and nobles, but by the countless hands that worked the fields, wove the textiles, tended the herds, built the terraces, and carried out rituals that honoured the gods. To see the Incas clearly, one must look beyond the palaces and into the villages, into the homes built of stone and thatch, where the majority of people lived lives shaped by cycles of labour, family, and tradition. Daily life was modest, but it was the foundation upon which the empire's grandeur rested. The elu was the basic unit of social organisation, the kin-based community that tied individuals together through blood, marriage, and shared labour. Each elu controlled land, pastures, and resources, which were distributed among its members for cultivation. Families worked these plots collectively, knowing that their harvest not only fed their households, but also contributed to the larger obligations of the community, the state, and the temples. The elu was both practical and spiritual, for it linked its members not only to each other, but also to shared ancestors whose spirits were honoured in rituals and whose guidance was sought in times of decision. Homes of common citizens were typically modest, built of stone or adobe with thatched roofs, clustered together in villages near fields and pastures. Interiors were simple, with few possessions beyond tools, textiles, and pottery. Yet these homes were filled with meaning. Hearths provided warmth and a place for cooking. Woven mats and blankets offered comfort, and storage pits held food supplies to sustain families between harvests. Despite their simplicity, these spaces were tied to the wider rhythms of the community, the empire, and the cosmos. Daily tasks were not isolated chores, but contributions to the ongoing balance of life. Men and women shared labour, though with distinct responsibilities. Men worked the fields, herded llamas and alpacas, and served in the mita system when called upon. Women spun and wove textiles, brewed chicha, tended household gardens, and cared for children. Their weaving was especially significant, for textiles carried symbolic and spiritual weight, marking identity, rank, and obligation. Children participated in tasks from an early age, learning to farm, weave, or herd alongside their parents. Education was practical, rooted in observation and repetition, though in noble families children could also receive training in administration, religion, and military arts. Agriculture structured the rhythm of daily life. Planting, weeding, harvesting, and preserving crops marked the seasons. Potatoes, maize, and quinoa were staples, supplemented by beans, peppers, and squash. Families stored surplus in their homes or contributed it to communal and state storehouses. Herding was equally important, with llamas providing transport and meat, alpacas offering wool, and both contributing dung for fertilizer. Herds were moved between altitudes to take advantage of seasonal pastures, reflecting the vertical integration of Andean life. Food was prepared through boiling, roasting, and drying, with chuño, the freeze-dried potato, serving as a durable and reliable staple that could last for years. Clothing reflected both practicality and identity. Men typically wore tunics called unku, belted at the waist with cloaks for warmth. Women wore ankle-length dresses known as anaku, fastened with pins and wrapped in shawls. Sandals made from llama hide protected feet. Textiles were woven in patterns that indicated regional or community identity, ensuring that individuals were visually tied to their aliu. Clothing also marked social status, with finer materials and more elaborate designs reserved for nobles. Even in daily life, textiles served as visible reminders of the social and cosmic order. Religion permeated ordinary life as much as it did the ceremonies of the elite. Families made daily offerings of coca leaves, maize or chicha to household huacas, which could be stones, springs or small shrines believed to house spirits. Rituals marked births, marriages and deaths, tying individuals into the cycles of the cosmos. Farmers prayed before planting, herders offered thanks for healthy animals, and communities celebrated festivals that honoured local gods alongside imperial deities like Inti. Even the most ordinary tasks carried spiritual weight, reminding people that their lives were part of a larger order, sustained by reciprocity with the divine. Social life revolved around cooperation. Families joined together for communal labour in the fields, repairing terraces or building irrigation canals. Festivals and ceremonies brought communities together for dancing, music and feasting, reinforcing bonds of kinship and solidarity. The principle of aini, or reciprocity, guided relationships. Those who gave labour or goods could expect to receive help in return. This principle extended from households to the empire itself, creating a web of obligations that sustained social and political stability. Marriage was an important institution, arranged by families and often formalised through community ceremonies. Couples lived together in modest homes, contributing to their aliu's labour and raising children who would continue the cycle. Polygamy existed among nobles, who used marriages to forge alliances, but among common citizens monogamy was the norm. Divorce was permitted, though frowned upon, and widows or widowers were often supported by their community. The family was the foundation of social life, but it was always embedded within the aliu and the empire. Festivals punctuated the routine of work, bringing joy and collective identity to daily life. Music, dance, and feasting marked the cycles of planting and harvest, solstices and equinoxes, and imperial celebrations like Inti Raymi. Even ordinary citizens participated in these events, contributing offerings, dancing in plazas, and drinking chicha brewed for the occasion. These festivals reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, tied to the cosmos and the empire through shared ritual. Children grew up immersed in this rhythm of life. From an early age they learned tasks by imitation, boys herding young llamas, girls spinning wool. Formal education was limited to noble families, where children might be trained in administration, religion, and warfare. But all children learned the skills necessary for survival in their environment. Stories and songs passed down oral traditions, teaching values of reciprocity, respect for ancestors, and reverence for the gods. Play often mirrored adult activities, with children imitating farming, weaving, and rituals, preparing them for their future roles. Leisure was limited but present. Storytelling, music, and games filled moments between tasks. Coca chewing provided stimulation and relief from hunger and fatigue, while chicha was consumed during both daily life and special occasions. Social gatherings strengthened bonds within the aliu, ensuring that no one was truly isolated. The Incas valued community above individualism, and this was reflected in how leisure, like labour, was shared. Health and medicine were tied to both practical knowledge and spiritual belief. Herbal remedies treated common ailments, while rituals addressed illnesses believed to be caused by spiritual imbalance. Healers, or curanderos, combined botanical knowledge with divination, seeking to restore harmony between the patient and the cosmos. Childbirth was assisted by midwives, while death was accompanied by ceremonies that ensured safe passage to the realm of ancestors. The boundary between medicine and religion was porous, reflecting the holistic view of life in Inca society. Despite the grandeur of the empire, most citizens lived modest lives, their horizons defined by their aliu, their fields and their festivals. Yet through the mita system, many also experienced the wider empire, serving in armies, building roads, or working in distant regions. These experiences broadened their understanding of Tawantinsuyu, connecting their local lives to the larger whole. A villager might spend months working on a fortress, or marching with an army, returning home with stories of distant lands and new responsibilities. In this way, the empire touched every household, making even the most ordinary citizen part of a vast project. Daily life under the Incas was not free of hardship. Labour was demanding. Food security depended on the success of harvests, and the obligations of the Asitar could strain families. Yet the system provided stability, security, and a sense of belonging. Famine was rare, resources were redistributed, and festivals provided joy. The reciprocity between people, community, state, and gods gave meaning to work and hardship alike. Life was simple, but it was embedded in a world of order, beauty, and sacredness. From the perspective of ordinary citizens, the empire was not an abstract concept but a tangible reality. It was seen in the terraces that held their crops, the roads they travelled during Mita service, the storehouses that fed them in hard times, and the festivals that filled their plazas with music and dance. Tawantinsuyu was not just the rule of a distant Sapa Inca, but the daily rhythm of life itself. The greatness of the empire was sustained by millions of small actions, each family contributing to a system that in return gave them security, identity, and a place in the cosmic order. From the lives of common citizens, the story of the Incas turns toward the empire as a whole, seen at its height when order, diversity, and unity reached their greatest expression. The daily labours of farmers, herders, and weavers built the foundation, but together those labours created an empire that stretched across the Andes, binding countless peoples into one system that radiated from Cusco. To see the empire at its height is to see the culmination of all these threads, political, religious, economic, and social, woven into a single tapestry of power and unity. The strength of Tawantinsuyu lay not only in its roads, terraces, armies, and rulers, but in its ability to hold together a vast and diverse empire at its height. The Inca state extended across 4 great regions, the Suyus, reaching from the fertile valleys of Ecuador in the north to the deserts of Chile in the south, from the high plateaus of Bolivia to the eastern slopes of the Andes that touch the Amazon basin. Within this expanse lived millions of people from hundreds of different ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping their own local gods, and maintaining traditions rooted in their unique landscapes. To govern such an empire required more than conquest. It required order, a framework that allowed diversity to flourish within unity. The empire at its height was not a uniform mass, but a carefully balanced system that combined central authority with local identity, creating a mosaic bound together by shared obligations, rituals, and infrastructure. At the centre of this order was Cusco, the navel of the world, where all roads converged and from which authority radiated outward. From Cusco, the empire was divided into 4 Suyus, Chinchaysuyu to the northwest, Collasuyu to the southeast, Antisuyu to the northeast, and Cuntisuyu to the southwest. These quarters were not arbitrary divisions, but reflections of a cosmic vision, with Cusco as the centre of the universe and the Suyus as its limbs. Each Suyu was governed by officials appointed by the Sapa Inca, supported by local leaders who were incorporated into the imperial system. The division of the empire into 4 parts mirrored the Inca emphasis on balance and duality, creating a structure that was both practical and symbolic. The administration of the empire was meticulous. Officials known as curacas governed provinces, overseeing labour, tribute, and ritual. They were often drawn from local elites, ensuring continuity and minimizing resistance. The Incas did not erase local leadership but integrated it, demanding loyalty to Cusco while allowing communities to maintain their traditions. These curacas reported to higher officials, who in turn answered to governors of the Suyus, creating a hierarchy that extended from the smallest village to the Sapa Inca himself. The system of administration ensured that orders from Cusco reached even the most distant corners of the empire, while local concerns could be transmitted upward. The quipu was a crucial tool in this system. Made of strings with knots tied in various positions and colours, quipus recorded numerical data, tracking tribute, population, and resources. Specialists known as quipucamayos read and maintained these records, ensuring that the empire could monitor its vast resources without written language. Through quipus, the Incas knew how many workers could be mobilized, how much food was stored in kolkas, and how many soldiers could be called upon. The precision of this system allowed them to manage an empire of millions with remarkable efficiency. Diversity was not only tolerated but incorporated into the imperial system. Conquered peoples were required to adopt Quechua as the administrative language, but they were allowed to maintain their own languages and traditions in daily life. Local gods were honoured and incorporated into the empire's pantheon, though always subordinated to Inti and the cult of the sun. Festivals tied to local huacas continued, but they were aligned with the imperial calendar. This balance allowed people to feel both part of the empire and loyal to their own heritage. The Incas did not seek to erase difference, but to harness it within a larger framework of order. The policy of Mitmac further reinforced this integration. By resettling populations across the empire, the Incas prevented rebellion, spread skills, and created communities that were bound to Cusco rather than to their original homelands. These resettled groups maintained their identities while adapting to new environments, creating pockets of diversity within the empire's structure. This movement of people was disruptive, but it also fostered a sense of interconnectedness, as communities from distant regions encountered one another and shared their traditions. Religion provided a unifying framework. The cult of Inti was celebrated across the empire, with temples to the sun established in major centres and rituals performed according to the imperial calendar. Representatives from conquered peoples were required to send offerings to Cusco, symbolically acknowledging the supremacy of the Sapa Inca and the gods of the capital. Yet local huacas remained important, ensuring that communities did not feel severed from their traditions. This balance of imperial and local religion reinforced unity without crushing diversity. Economically, the empire at its height was sustained by the mita system. Communities provided labour for agriculture, construction, and military service, while the state redistributed food and resources through its storehouses. Surpluses ensured stability, even in times of drought or disaster. The roads facilitated the movement of goods, armies and information, binding distant regions into a single economic system. The absence of money was not a limitation. Rather, the empire functioned on the basis of labour, reciprocity and redistribution. This system provided security and abundance, making Tawantinsuyu one of the most resilient empires of its time. The diversity of the empire was visible in its festivals, markets and cities. Delegations from across the Suyus gathered in Cusco for major ceremonies, bringing with them distinctive clothing, music and offerings. Markets in provincial centres displayed goods from across the empire: potatoes and maize from the highlands, cotton and cocoa from the valleys, fish and shells from the coast, and exotic feathers and fruits from the Amazon. These exchanges were not driven by profit, but by reciprocity and redistribution, reflecting the collective orientation of Inca society. To walk through a market was to see the empire's diversity brought together in one place, a living tapestry of Tawantinsuyu. The empire at its height was also a place of remarkable stability. Rebellions were rare, and when they did occur, they were swiftly suppressed. Roads and storehouses ensured that armies could respond quickly, while the integration of local elites minimized resistance. The system of reciprocity, where the state provided security and abundance in return for labor, gave people tangible reasons to accept imperial rule. The grandeur of Cusco, the splendor of festivals, and the abundance of food in storehouses reinforced the legitimacy of the system. For many, life under the Incas was more secure than it had been under fragmented local polities. Yet this stability masked underlying tensions. The system depended heavily on the authority of the Sapa Inca, whose divine status held the empire together. Succession was never simple, for the choice of heir was often contested among the many sons of the ruler. The balance between local traditions and imperial demands could also strain communities, especially when Micmac resettlements uprooted families or when labour obligations became burdensome. Diversity was a strength, but it was also a challenge, requiring constant effort to maintain unity. At its height, Tawantinsuyu represented one of the most remarkable achievements of human organisation. It held together millions of people across thousands of kilometres, uniting mountains, valleys, deserts and coasts into a single system. It did so without wheels, iron or written language, relying instead on roads, quipus, terraces, and the principle of reciprocity. It created order without erasing diversity, integrating local traditions into a larger framework. It was both fragile and resilient, dependent on the balance of its parts and the authority of its centre. From this height, however, the empire would soon be shaken by conflict from within. The death of a ruler and the contest for succession between his sons would plunge Tawantinsuyu into civil war, weakening its unity just as a new threat approached from across the sea. To see the fall of the empire, one must first understand this internal conflict, the struggle between Huasca and Atahualpa, whose rivalry fractured the order that had held the empire together at its height. The unity of Tawantinsuyu, so carefully maintained through roads, rituals and reciprocity, was always most vulnerable at the moment of succession. The Sapa Inca was not merely a ruler, but the divine axis of the empire, the son of the sun around whom order revolved. His death created a vacuum that could not be easily filled, for unlike some monarchies that followed strict rules of primogeniture, the Incas had no fixed system for determining the heir. The choice of successor often depended on the support of nobles, generals, priests, and the panicas of previous rulers. In times of strength, this process produced capable leaders who carried the empire forward. But in times of division, it could ignite conflicts that shook Tawantinsuyu to its foundations. Such was the case with the death of Huayna Capac, the ruler who had brought the empire to its greatest territorial extent, and whose passing set the stage for the devastating civil war between his sons, Huasca and Atahualpa. Huayna Capac had inherited a strong and expanding empire, and under his leadership the Incas extended their control into northern Ecuador, defeating powerful societies and establishing new centres of administration. Yet his campaigns also meant that he spent long periods away from Cusco, ruling in practice from Quito in the north. There he took wives and concubines, forging alliances with local elites and fathering many children. Among these children were Huasca, born in Cusco to the Coya, the principal queen of royal lineage, and Atahualpa, born in Quito to a noble woman of the north. Both had claims to legitimacy, though of different kinds. Huasca as the son of the principal wife in the traditional capital, and Atahualpa as the son who had grown up alongside his father in the newly conquered northern territories, close to the armies and generals who had secured them. When Huayna Capac died, likely of an epidemic disease that swept through the Andes before the Spanish fully arrived, the empire was left with no clear successor. Some accounts suggest that he named Ninan Cuyuchi, another son, as heir, but Ninan too died of the same illness. The throne was thus left contested, and the empire divided between Huasca in Cusco and Atahualpa in Quito. At first the division was uneasy but not immediately violent. Huasca was recognized as Sapa Inca in Cusco, the traditional heart of the empire, but Atahualpa retained power in the north, supported by seasoned generals who had fought with his father in Ecuador. The stage was set for conflict, with the empire effectively split between two centres of power. Huasca sought to assert his authority by demanding loyalty from Atahualpa and the northern elite. He ordered that Atahualpa acknowledge his supremacy, send tribute to Cusco, and accept the traditional hierarchy of the empire. Atahualpa, however, resisted, relying on his generals and the support of northern provinces that had grown accustomed to his leadership. The conflict escalated from political tension to open war, as Huáscar sent armies north to enforce his claim. The war that followed was brutal and destructive, pitting Inca against Inca, Elu against Elu, and tearing apart the unity that had made the empire strong. Huáscar commanded loyalty in the south, particularly in Cusco and its surrounding regions, while Atahualpa drew strength from the north, especially from Quito and the seasoned armies stationed there. Both sides mobilized thousands of soldiers through the Miter system, drawing on the empire's vast population. Campaigns moved back and forth across the Andes, with battles fought in valleys, on high plateaus, and along the empire's roads. Atahualpa proved to be the more effective commander, though much of his success was due to the skill of his generals, particularly Chalcuchimac, Quisquis, and Rumiñahui. These men were veterans of Huayna Capac's northern campaigns and had deep experience in warfare. They organized Atahualpa's forces with discipline, using strategy and coordination to defeat Huáscar's armies. Huáscar, by contrast, struggled to command effectively, relying on his status rather than military skill. His forces suffered a series of defeats, and as the war dragged on, morale in his camp declined. The civil war was not only a struggle for the throne, but also a clash of regional loyalties. The north and south of the empire, though unified under Huayna Capac, had distinct identities and traditions. Huáscar's claim rested on the legitimacy of Cusco and the royal lineage, while Atahualpa's rested on the loyalty of northern armies and the prestige of recent conquests. Communities were forced to choose sides, and the bonds of empire that had once united them were strained. The principle of reciprocity, the rituals of the calendar, and the authority of the Sapa Inca were overshadowed by the chaos of fratricidal war. The turning point came when Atahualpa's generals launched a decisive campaign into the heart of the empire. Huáscar's forces were defeated in a series of battles, and Cusco itself was threatened. Huáscar was captured and taken prisoner, his supporters executed or forced into submission. Atahualpa emerged as the victor, though he had not yet been formally crowned in Cusco. His triumph was the result of military strength and strategic brilliance, but it came at a terrible cost. The empire was weakened, its unity shattered, and its people divided. Atahualpa, still in the north when victory was secured, delayed his journey to Cusco. He maintained control from Quito, trusting his generals to manage the south. This hesitation, whether due to caution, arrogance, or political calculation, would prove fateful. For while Atahualpa consolidated his power, a new force was entering the Andes, small in number but armed with weapons, animals, and diseases that the Incas had never seen before. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, were already advancing into the empire, and they found an Inca state torn apart by civil war, its people exhausted by conflict, and its leaders divided. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa thus marked the beginning of the end of Tawantinsuyu. What might have been a strong and resilient empire capable of resisting foreign invaders was instead a fractured state, its armies depleted, its loyalties divided, and its legitimacy contested. The Spaniards would exploit these divisions, using them to conquer an empire that had once seemed unassailable. The struggle between brothers, born of succession and regional rivalry, had opened the door to conquest. From the ashes of civil war, the story of the Incas moves to the arrival of the Spaniards, whose ships, horses, steel, and guns brought a new form of power to the Andes. To see how Tawantinsuyu fell, one must watch the meeting of Atahualpa and Pizarro, the capture at Cajamarca, and the unravelling of an empire already weakened from within. The empire of the Incas, stretched across mountains and valleys, bound together by roads and rituals, stood at the height of its territorial expanse when strangers from across the ocean first entered its world. These men, fewer than 200, carried weapons of iron, rode horses never before seen in the Andes, and bore diseases that had already begun to spread ahead of them. decimating populations before their eyes were even laid upon Europeans. The Spanish arrival did not strike an empire in full strength. It struck an empire weakened by civil war, its armies divided between Huasca and Atahualpa, its loyalties fractured and its authority shaken. What might once have resisted foreign intrusion with overwhelming force was now vulnerable, its unity broken and its divine order tested. Francisco Pizarro, the leader of this small band, had already scouted the Andean world in earlier expeditions. By the time he returned in 1532, he carried with him not only the ambition of conquest, but also the knowledge that the Incas were in disarray. His force was tiny compared to the millions who lived under the rule of Tawantinsuyu, but he understood that strength lay not only in numbers but in strategy, audacity and exploitation of divisions. He also knew, as did his men, that the wealth of the Andes, its gold, silver and abundance, could transform them from poor adventurers into great lords in Spain. When Pizarro's men advanced into the empire, they were met with both curiosity and uncertainty. The Incas had never seen horses, men clad in steel, or firearms that spat thunder and smoke. Some interpreted the Spaniards through the lens of prophecy, connecting them to Viracocha or other divine figures. Others saw them as strange but mortal men. Atahualpa, having triumphed over his brother and secured the throne, was in Cajamarca with his army when the Spaniards approached. Confident in his recent victories and in the strength of his forces, he agreed to meet these foreigners who had arrived in his land. The encounter at Cajamarca became one of the most shocking turning points in world history. Atahualpa entered the plaza with thousands of attendants, carried on a litter, adorned with gold and feathers, confident in his majesty. The Spaniards, vastly outnumbered, prepared an ambush. A friar named Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa, presenting him with a Bible, and demanding that he accept Christianity and submit to the King of Spain. Atahualpa, unfamiliar with the object and offended by the demand, cast it aside. This act became the pretext for violence. The Spaniards, hidden with their cannons, firearms and horses, launched their attack. The sound of explosions, the charge of cavalry, and the shock of steel weapons created chaos among the Inca attendants who had never encountered such warfare. Atahualpa was seized, his litter overturned, and thousands of his followers were killed or trampled in the panic. The Sapa Inca, the living son of the sun, the axis of Tawantinsuyu, was taken captive by fewer than 200 men. With his capture, the empire was thrown into crisis. Atahualpa, held prisoner, sought to secure his release by offering a ransom unlike anything the Spaniards had ever seen. He promised to fill a room with gold and 2 with silver, gathered from across the empire. Over the following months, treasures flowed into Cajamarca: golden idols, silver vessels, ornaments from temples and sacred objects of immeasurable value. The Spaniards melted much of it down into ingots, destroying the artistry that had given it meaning. To them it was wealth. To the Incas it was sacred, but in the hands of the Spaniards it became bullion for shipment across the sea. Despite fulfilling his promise, Atahualpa was not released. Fearing his power and the loyalty he still commanded, the Spaniards tried him on charges of idolatry, fratricide, and conspiracy. He was condemned to death. At first sentenced to be burned, Atahualpa accepted baptism to avoid this fate and was instead strangled with a garrote in 1533. The death of the Sapa Inca, executed by foreigners in a remote town, shattered the cosmic order of the empire. The son of the sun was gone, and with him the living embodiment of Tawantinsuyu. The Spaniards, though small in number, exploited the divisions left by civil war to press their conquest further. With Atahualpa dead, they installed Manco Inca, a young prince, as a puppet ruler, hoping to govern through him. They marched into Cusco, the sacred capital, and seized its treasures, stripping temples of gold and silver, plundering palaces and imposing their rule. The Coricancha, once lined with golden panels that reflected the brilliance of Inti, was looted, its sacred objects melted down. The city that had been the navel of the world was humbled by a handful of men armed with steel and driven by greed. Yet conquest was not immediate or uncontested. Resistance flared across the empire. Manco Inca himself, initially cooperating with the Spaniards, eventually rebelled when he realized their ambitions. In 1536, he led a massive uprising, besieging Cusco with tens of thousands of warriors. The city was nearly lost and Spanish survival hung by a thread. But horses, firearms, and the arrival of reinforcements turned the tide. Manco was forced to retreat, eventually establishing a neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba, deep in the jungle, where resistance continued for decades. The Spaniards, meanwhile, fought not only the Incas but also each other. Rivalries among conquistadors led to bloody conflicts over control of Peru. Even as they imposed their rule, they struggled to maintain unity. For the Andean peoples, this presented both opportunities and hardships, as some allied with Spaniards to settle old grievances while others resisted fiercely. The conquest was not a single moment, but a prolonged process of battles, negotiations, betrayals, and accommodations. The fall of the Inca Empire was not only a military conquest, but also a transformation of society. The Spaniards imposed new institutions, demanded tribute, and restructured the Mitre into a system of forced labour in mines, particularly the silver mines of Potosi. Christianity was spread, temples were converted into churches, and rituals were suppressed or adapted. The Quipu system fell into disuse, replaced by Spanish writing. Diseases continued to devastate populations, reducing millions to mere fractions of their former numbers. The world of Tawantinsuyu, once ordered by reciprocity and sacred time, was replaced by a colonial system that extracted wealth for distant kings and empires. Yet the Incas did not vanish. Resistance persisted in Vilcabamba until 1572, when the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. Even then, memory of the empire endured, preserved in stories, traditions, and identities that outlived conquest. Communities continued to honour their huacas in secret, to weave textiles with ancient patterns, to farm terraces built by their ancestors, and to speak Quechua, the language of the empire. The Spaniards imposed their rule, but the soul of Tawantinsuyu lived on in the resilience of its people. The Spanish arrival and the fall of the Inca Empire were among the most dramatic collisions of worlds in history. A small band of Europeans, driven by ambition and greed, destroyed one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas. They succeeded not because of superior numbers, but because of timing, technology, and the divisions created by civil war. The capture and execution of Atahualpa, the plundering of Cusco, and the transformation of the Mitre into a tool of exploitation mark the end of an empire, but not the end of a people. The Inca legacy would endure, reshaped but not erased, carried forward by generations who remembered the order of Tawantinsuyu even under foreign rule. From the fall of the empire, the story of the Incas moves to their legacy, to the survival of traditions, the endurance of language, and the memory of a civilization whose terraces still climb the mountains, whose roads still trace the Andes, and whose vision of order and reciprocity continues to echo through time. Though the empire of Tawantinsuyu collapsed beneath the weight of conquest, disease, and civil war, the story of the Incas did not end with Atahualpa's execution or the fall of Cusco. Empires may vanish, rulers may be overthrown, and palaces may be reduced to ruins, but cultures endure, carried by the resilience of their people and the persistence of their traditions. The Incas left behind more than cities of stone and legends of conquest. They left a living legacy that still shapes the Andes and echoes far beyond its mountains. To walk through Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, or Chile today is to find traces of their vision embedded in daily life, in language, in agriculture, in ritual, and in memory. The most visible legacy of the Incas remains their architecture and engineering. Terraces still cling to mountainsides, many of them cultivated by farmers who continue to use the same techniques developed centuries ago. Roads of the Hapak Nyan still wind across valleys and ridges, some paved with stone, others marked only by the faint traces of paths once trodden by armies and messengers. Bridges of rope, rebuilt generation after generation, continue to span gorges, connecting communities in ways that modern highways often cannot. Machu Picchu, rediscovered by outsiders in the early 20th century, has become a symbol not only of the Incas but of human ingenuity itself, a city where stone and mountain appear as one. Yet it is not alone. Sites like Ollantaytambo, Pisac and Sacsayhuaman continue to inspire awe, reminders that the Incas built not only for their own time but for eternity. Agricultural practices also preserve their genius. In the highlands, farmers still plant potatoes in dozens of varieties, preserving biodiversity that sustains food security even in the face of climate change. Chuño, the freeze-dried potato perfected by the Incas, remains a staple food, produced through the same methods of freezing and drying that have been passed down for centuries. Quinoa, once a sacred grain, has spread far beyond the Andes, celebrated worldwide as a superfood, but it remains rooted in Inca traditions of cultivation and ritual. The terraces of Moray, once an agricultural laboratory, still demonstrate how the Incas experimented with microclimates and adaptation, knowledge that modern science continues to study. Their agricultural legacy is not a relic but a living practice, evidence of how their vision of reciprocity with the land remains relevant. Language carries another strand of Inca survival. Quechua, the administrative language of the empire, is still spoken by millions across the Andes, from Colombia to Argentina. It is one of the largest surviving indigenous languages of the Americas, carrying within its vocabulary the worldview of Tawantinsuyu. Words like Ailu, Aini, and Pachamama express concepts of community, reciprocity, and the living earth that shaped Inca society. Even where Spanish dominates, Quechua survives in place names, in songs, in stories, and in the voices of those who continue to pass it to their children. Through language, the Incas endure, speaking across centuries to remind us of their presence. Religion and ritual, though transformed by conquest and Christianity, also retain echoes of Inca belief. Festivals such as Inti Raymi are still celebrated in Cusco, reenacting the great festival of the sun with music, dance and offerings. Catholic saints' days in the Andes often overlap with older rituals, creating hybrid celebrations where the Virgin is honoured alongside Pachamama, and processions of saints mirror processions once made for huacas. Farmers still make offerings of coca leaves, pouring libations of chicha to the earth before planting, acknowledging the spirits of the mountains and the fertility of the soil. Though temples were turned into churches, the sacred landscape of the Andes has never lost its meaning. The Apus, the mountain spirits, are still honoured, and the cycles of the sun and moon still mark the rhythms of life. The social principles of the Incas also persist. Aini, reciprocity, continues to guide relationships in Andean communities, where neighbours help one another with planting, building or herding, knowing that assistance will be returned when needed. Minca, communal labour for the benefit of the community, echoes the Mita system, though now directed toward a local rather than imperial projects. These traditions of cooperation sustain communities where modern economies often fail, providing resilience in the face of poverty and inequality. The legacy of Inca organisation is not only remembered in history books, but lived in the daily interactions of Andean villagers. Memory of the Incas has also served as a source of identity and resistance. During colonial rule, the memory of the empire inspired rebellions, most famously that of Tupac Amaru Theth in the 18th century, who claimed descent from the Inca line and sought to restore independence. Though his rebellion was crushed, his name became a symbol of resistance, invoked by movements for indigenous rights and independence centuries later. Even in modern times, the figure of the Inca serves as a reminder of a proud heritage, a counterpoint to colonial narratives of subjugation. Monuments, literature, and music continue to evoke the Incas as a source of strength and continuity. Archaeology and historical study have also deepened the legacy. Excavations at Machu Picchu, Cusco, and other sites have revealed details of Inca life, while the preservation of mummies, textiles, and ceramics provides tangible connections to the past. These discoveries not only enrich our understanding of the empire, but also reaffirm the sophistication and resilience of Andean cultures. Museums across the world display Inca artifacts, but in the Andes, the legacy is not confined to glass cases. It is lived, remembered, and honoured by those whose ancestors built the empire. The fall of the empire did not erase its vision of order and reciprocity. Instead, that vision adapted, surviving beneath the surface of colonial rule and re-emerging in traditions that continue to this day. The terraces still climb the mountains, the roads still cross the valleys, the language still echoes in markets and homes, and the rituals still honour the sun, the moon, and the earth. The Incas endure not as a vanished civilization but as a living heritage, carried forward by generations who continue to find meaning in their legacy. To speak of the Incas, then, is not only to tell of the rise of a great empire and its sudden fall, but also to recognise the survival of a worldview that continues to shape lives. Their legacy is not frozen in ruins, but alive in fields, in words, in songs, and in the identity of millions. Tawantinsuyu may no longer exist as a political entity, but as a memory, a tradition, and a source of strength, it remains. The echoes of the Andes carry their story, reminding us that even empires that fall can leave legacies that endure for centuries, shaping the world in ways that outlast conquest and colonization.